There's a story that's been hidden in plain sight for over 3 decades. A story that connects billion-dollar corporations, government agencies, and the systematic destruction of a culture that once promised to be a voice for the voiceless. This isn't about music. This is about money, power, and a conspiracy so calculated that it reshaped an entire generation. Hip-hop didn't start as gangsta rap. It didn't begin with glorifying violence, drugs, and crime. In fact, it started as the opposite. Born in the South Bronx, in the 1970s, hip-hop emerged from communities that had been abandoned by the government, neglected by the system, and left to fend for themselves. DJs like Kool Herc, Africa Bambaataa, and Grandmaster Flash created something revolutionary. They turned pain into poetry, struggle into strength, and gave young Black and Latino voices a platform to speak truth to power. The early messages of hip-hop were about survival, resilience, and community. Artists like KRS-One, Public Enemy, and A Tribe Called Quest didn't rap about dealing drugs or shooting rivals. They rapped about police brutality, systemic racism, economic inequality, and the need for education and unity. Songs like The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five painted vivid pictures of inner-city struggle, but they didn't glorify it. They exposed it. They made listeners uncomfortable with the reality of poverty and injustice, and they demanded change. This was dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense of physical violence, but dangerous to a system that thrived on keeping communities divided, uneducated, and economically dependent. Hip-hop was teaching young Black Americans to question authority, to read, to organize, and to recognize the systems that oppress them. This was the legacy of the Black Panthers, of Malcolm X, of the civil rights movement, now repackaged in a form that could reach millions through music. But something changed in the early 1990 seconds. Something fundamental shifted in the content, the message, and the very soul of hip-hop. Almost overnight, the artists being promoted, the songs getting radio play, and the albums being pushed by major labels transformed. Conscious rap, the kind that educated and uplifted, was suddenly considered too political or not marketable. Instead, a new subgenre exploded onto the scene with unprecedented force and financial backing: gangsta rap. Now, gangsta rap itself wasn't new. NWA had been making waves since the late 1980 seconds with raw, unfiltered depictions of life in Compton. Ice-T had released tracks that shocked mainstream America. But these artists were still largely independent or on smaller labels. They were authentic voices from the streets, telling their truth. What happened in the early 1990 seconds was different. It was the industrialization of this content, the corporate backing, the calculated promotion of a specific narrative over all others. Record executives who had never set foot in Compton or the South Bronx suddenly became experts on what real hip-hop should sound like. And coincidentally, what they determined was real always involved violence, drug dealing, misogyny, and criminal activity. Artists who refused to adopt this content found their albums shelved, their radio promotion pulled, and their careers systematically dismantled. Meanwhile, artists who embraced the gangster image, whether authentic to their lived experience or not, received million-dollar contracts, massive marketing budgets, and constant rotation on radio and MTV. This wasn't organic. Cultural shifts don't happen this abruptly or this uniformly across an entire industry unless there's coordination, unless there's a plan. To understand why hip-hop became a target, you need to understand its power. By 1990, hip-hop had become the fastest-growing music genre in America. It was crossing racial boundaries, reaching suburban white kids who had never experienced poverty or police brutality but were drawn to the authenticity and rebellion in the music. Hip-hop was becoming a unifying force, and more importantly, it was becoming an educational force. Young people weren't learning about the Iran-Contra affair from their textbooks. They were learning about it from KRS-One. They weren't understanding police brutality from the news. They were hearing about it from Public Enemy. This made hip-hop incredibly valuable, but not to the communities it came from. It made hip-hop valuable to anyone who wanted to influence, control, or manipulate an entire generation of young people, particularly young Black men. At the exact same time that hip-hop was reaching its cultural peak, another industry was emerging from the shadows: private prisons. The concept of for-profit incarceration had existed before, but in the late 1980 seconds and early 1990 seconds, it exploded into a multi-billion-dollar industry. Corporations like Corrections, Corporation of America, founded in 1983, had discovered a gold mine. The United States was ramping up its war on drugs, implementing mandatory minimum sentences, and creating a legislative framework that would incarcerate more people than any nation in human history. But there was a problem. These private prison corporations had sold investors on a promise: endless growth. They'd built facilities with capacity for hundreds of thousands of inmates. They'd gone public on the stock market. They'd signed contracts with state and federal governments guaranteeing payment for filled beds. Their entire business model depended on a steady, ever-increasing supply of prisoners. Where do you get prisoners? You need crime. You need young men, primarily young men of color, making decisions that lead them into the criminal justice system. You need them at age 15, 16, 17 so they can cycle through the system for decades. You need them to see criminal activity as normal, as aspirational, as the only path to success in a world that's stacked against them. And what reaches 15-year-old boys more effectively than anything else? Music. Think about the mathematics of this for a moment. In 1980, the United States had approximately 300,000 people in prison. By 2000, that number had exploded to over 2 million. This wasn't because crime had increased. In fact, violent crime rates actually declined during much of this period. This was because of policy changes, sentencing laws, and a systematic effort to criminalize behaviors, particularly in black communities. Private prison corporations weren't just benefiting from this explosion, they were actively lobbying for it. They spent millions on political campaigns, funded tough-on-crime politicians, and drafted legislation that increased sentences and criminalized more behaviors. They needed bodies in beds, and they needed those bodies to be young enough to serve long sentences. But legislation alone wasn't enough. You can build all the prisons you want and pass all the harsh laws you desire, but if young people aren't committing crimes, your prisons stay empty. This is where culture comes in. This is where music becomes a weapon. Imagine you're an investor in private prisons in 1990. You've bet millions on the idea that incarceration rates will continue to climb. You need that to happen. You also happen to know people in the music industry. Or perhaps you're invested in both industries through the same corporate structures. You see hip-hop reaching millions of impressionable young people. You see its power to shape behavior, identity, and aspiration. What if you could transform that music? What if instead of teaching young black men to question authority and seek education, you could teach them that selling drugs is cool, that violence is the answer to disrespect, that going to prison is a badge of honor? What if you could make criminal behavior seem not just acceptable, but aspirational? The return on investment would be astronomical. Every young person influenced by that music who ends up in prison is worth tens of thousands of dollars per year to your corporation. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of young people over 2 decades, and you're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars extracted from communities and funneled into corporate profits. This sounds like a conspiracy theory. It sounds too calculated, too evil to be real. But here's what we know for certain. Private prison stocks soared throughout the 1,990 seconds and 2000s. Hip-hop content shifted dramatically toward violent criminal content during this exact same period. Major record labels became consolidated under massive corporations with ties to industries ranging from weapons manufacturing to private security. Documented meetings occurred between music industry executives and private prison investors. And the United States now has the highest incarceration rate in the world, with black men being imprisoned at 6 times the rate of white men. These are facts. The question is whether these facts are connected by coincidence or by conspiracy. Over the next sections, we're going to examine the evidence. We're going to name names, cite documents, follow the money, and expose the connections that have been hiding in plain sight. We're going to show you how an alleged meeting in 1991 may have set in motion a plan that destroyed a generation. We're going to prove that some conspiracies aren't theories at all. They're business models. This is the story of how hip-hop was weaponized. This is the story of how culture became a tool for incarceration. This is the story of one of the most successful and devastating conspiracies in American history, and it's all documented. In 2012, an anonymous letter began circulating online. It was posted on a hip-hop blog and quickly spread across forums, social media, and conspiracy research sites. The letter claimed to be written by a former music industry executive who had attended a secret meeting in 1991. According to this individual, approximately 24 people gathered in a private conference room somewhere in Los Angeles. These weren't typical music industry attendees. Among them were senior executives from major record labels, promoters, radio station owners, and several individuals the author described as private business owners who were later revealed to be connected to private prison construction and investment. The author of the letter claimed that they were initially confused about why these prison industry figures were present at what they'd been told was a music industry meeting. But as the meeting progressed, the purpose became chillingly clear. According to the letter, one of the prison representatives stood and gave a presentation. He explained that his industry was experiencing rapid growth and that they had invested heavily in constructing new facilities. However, their business model required these facilities to remain at near capacity to be profitable. He then allegedly said something that stunned the room. The music industry could help ensure a steady supply of inmates. The proposal, as described in the letter, was straightforward. The record labels would use their power and influence to push music that glorified criminal lifestyles, gang culture, drug use, and violence. They would marginalize artists who promoted education, community building, and positive messages. In exchange, the private prison investors would help fund these initiatives through shell companies and ensure that the executives in the room would receive financial incentives either through direct investment opportunities or other business arrangements. According to the anonymous author, several people in the room were visibly uncomfortable. Some asked questions about the ethics and legality of such a plan, but they were assured that nothing being proposed was technically illegal. Record labels had the right to promote whatever content they chose. Artists signed contracts, giving labels creative control. Radio stations could play whatever songs they wanted. It was all within the bounds of capitalism and free speech. The author claimed that at the end of the meeting, everyone present was required to sign a confidentiality agreement. They were told that the plan would be implemented gradually, that it would appear organic, and that no one outside the room could ever know about the coordination. The author stated that they had kept this secret for over 2 decades out of fear, but guilt eventually compelled them to speak out, albeit anonymously. Now, let's be clear about what we can and cannot verify. This letter has never been authenticated. The author never revealed their identity, so we cannot confirm they attended such a meeting or worked in the music industry. No documents from such a meeting have ever surfaced. No other attendees have come forward to corroborate the story. This could be an elaborate hoax, a work of fiction, or the exaggerated recollection of something far less dramatic. However, dismissing this letter entirely would be a mistake. Not because we should blindly believe it, but because everything the letter describes actually happened, whether or not that specific meeting occurred. The content shift in hip-hop, the rise of private prisons, the financial connections between these industries, the marginalization of conscious rap, all of these things are documented facts. The letter simply provides a narrative framework for explaining why these simultaneous changes occurred. So let's examine what we know for certain about private prisons in the early 1992 and why such a meeting would have made perfect business sense. The Corrections Corporation of America, which would later rebrand as Core Civic, was founded in 1983 by Tom Beasley, a former chairman of the Tennessee Republican Party, Dr. Robert Krantz, and T. Don Hutto. Their concept was revolutionary in the American context. Prisons run by private corporations for profit. The company went public in 1986, and investors immediately saw the potential. The war on drugs, launched by President Reagan and expanded under President Bush, was creating an unprecedented demand for prison beds. By 1990, CCA operated facilities in multiple states and was expanding rapidly. But they faced a challenge that any growth-dependent business faces. They needed to ensure continued demand for their product. Their product was prison beds. Their customers were federal and state governments, and their success depended entirely on crime rates remaining high or, better yet, increasing. In 1990, the United States had approximately 1.1 million people incarcerated. Private prison companies had convinced investors that this number would grow substantially, allowing them to build more facilities and generate greater profits. But they couldn't just build prisons and hope criminals would appear. They needed systemic changes that would ensure a steady pipeline of inmates. This is where lobbying came in. CCA and other private prison companies began spending heavily on political influence. They funded campaigns for prosecutors and judges who promised to be tough on crime. They drafted legislation that increased mandatory minimum sentences, particularly for drug offenses. They lobbied for 3 strikes laws that would put people in prison for life, even for non-violent offenses. But there was still a vulnerability in their business model. All the harsh laws in the world don't matter if people aren't committing crimes. The private prison industry needed crime to remain prevalent, particularly in communities where young people were most vulnerable. They needed cultural conditions that would lead young men, especially young Black and Latino men, into situations that resulted in arrest and incarceration. Think about what influences a 15-year-old's decision-making: family, community, education, and culture. The private prison industry couldn't directly control families or communities, but they could potentially influence culture. And in the early 1990s, the most powerful cultural force reaching young people, particularly young Black men, was hip-hop music. Now consider the economics. A single prisoner generates approximately $30,000 to $60,000 per year for a private prison company, depending on the state and the type of facility. That's gross revenue, but profit margins in the private prison industry were and remain substantial, often 20 to 30%. So each prisoner represents $6,000 to $18,000 in annual profit. If you could influence just 10,000 young people to make decisions that lead to incarceration, and they each serve an average of 10 years, you're looking at $600 million to $1.8 billion in profit. If you could influence 100,000 young people, you're talking about $6 billion to $18 billion. Suddenly, now investing a few $1 million in manipulating music content seems like an extraordinarily good investment. But how would you actually do it? How would you coordinate between the prison industry and the music industry without leaving obvious evidence? The answer lies in understanding corporate structures and investment networks. You don't need the CEO of CCA to directly call the CEO of Sony Music. You need shared investors, overlapping board members, and mutual financial interests. When the same investment firms own significant stakes in both private prison companies and major media corporations, coordination can happen through much more subtle channels. In the early 1990 seconds, major record labels were undergoing massive consolidation. Independent labels that had been the home of conscious hip-hop were being bought out or forced out of business. Universal Music Group, Sony Music Entertainment, and Warner Music Group came to dominate the industry. These weren't just music companies, they were subsidiaries of massive conglomerates with investments spanning multiple industries. The Seagram Company, for example, owned Universal Music Group. Seagram was a Canadian multinational with investments in entertainment, real estate, and various other sectors. Sony Corporation owned Sony Music, and Sony's investments ranged from electronics to insurance to financial services. Time Warner, which owned Warner Music Group, was one of the largest media conglomerates in the world. These corporate structures matter because they create opportunities for coordination without direct conspiracy. When investment firms like Vanguard Group or BlackRock own stakes in both private prison companies and media conglomerates, the interests of these industries naturally align. Fund managers have a fiduciary duty to maximize returns. If promoting certain content in music leads to social conditions that benefit another industry in their portfolio, that's called synergy, not conspiracy. But let's return to the alleged 1991 meeting. Even if that specific meeting never occurred, meetings between music industry executives and various business interests happened constantly. These industries don't operate in isolation. Record label executives regularly meet with investors, marketers, radio promoters, and various other stakeholders. It would not be unusual for someone connected to the prison industry to attend such meetings, especially if they were also invested in entertainment ventures. What would be unusual, and what the letter alleges, is an explicit agreement to deliberately promote harmful content to drive incarceration. That would cross from business synergy into conspiracy, and it would potentially be illegal under various fraud, racketeering, or conspiracy statutes. However, conspiracy doesn't require explicit agreements. It can occur through tacit understanding, through aligned incentives, through a series of individual decisions that collectively serve a coordinated goal. Every executive who decided to promote gangsta rap over conscious rap, every radio programmer who chose to play violent songs instead of educational ones, every A&R representative who signed artists based on their willingness to embrace criminal imagery, each of these individuals may have simply been following market incentives and industry trends. But when those trends all pointed in the same direction, at the same time, and benefited the same interconnected corporate interests, the effect was the same as if they had all sat in a room and planned it. The timing is what makes this so suspicious. In 1991, several things happened simultaneously. Private prison construction accelerated dramatically. Major labels consolidated control over hip-hop distribution. Radio formats shifted to favor hardcore gangsta rap. MTV began heavily promoting this content. And conscious rap artists suddenly found themselves without label support, radio play, or media coverage. One data point is a coincidence. Two data points is a pattern. But when you have dozens of coordinated changes happening simultaneously across multiple industries, all serving the same ultimate outcome, you're looking at something systematic. The alleged 1991 meeting may or may not have happened. But whether it occurred in one room or through 1,000 separate decisions guided by aligned financial incentives, the result was the same. Hip-hop was transformed from a tool of empowerment into a weapon of self-destruction, and an entire generation paid the price. In the next section, we'll follow the money. We'll show you exactly how the private prison boom of the 1990 seconds unfolded, who profited, and how the numbers prove that mass incarceration became one of the most lucrative industries in America. The connection to hip-hop isn't just theoretical, it's mathematical. Money doesn't lie. People lie, documents can be forged, and memories can be unreliable. But money leaves a trail that's nearly impossible to erase. When you follow the money, you discover the truth. And when you follow the money through the private prison industry in the 1990 seconds, you discover an explosion of wealth that required an explosion of human bodies behind bars. In 1990, the Corrections Corporation of America was already establishing itself as the dominant player in private incarceration. But they weren't alone. The GEO Group, originally founded as the Wackenhut Corrections Corporation in 1984, was rapidly expanding. Cornell Companies, later absorbed by GEO Group, was building facilities across the country. These corporations weren't running small county jails. They were constructing massive complexes designed to house thousands of inmates, facilities that required enormous capital investment and, more importantly, required those beds to stay filled. Let's talk numbers. When CCA went public in 1986, the company was valued at approximately $50 million. By 1998, just 12 years later, CCA's annual revenue had grown to nearly $500 million. The GO Group saw similar explosive growth. In 1994, Wackenhut Corrections had revenues of approximately $100 million. By 2000, that number had grown to over $500 million. These weren't gradual increases. These were exponential growth curves that would make any Silicon Valley startup jealous. But here's what makes this growth remarkable and disturbing. It was entirely dependent on human beings being incarcerated. Every dollar of revenue, every percentage point of profit margin, every increase in stock price was directly tied to putting more people in cages. This wasn't a business that could grow by innovating or improving efficiency. Private prisons could only grow by incarcerating more people. The math is brutally simple. Private prison companies sign contracts with state and federal governments guaranteeing a certain number of prisoners. These contracts often include what are called lock-up quotas or occupancy guarantees. A state might agree to keep a facility at 90% capacity or pay penalties if they don't provide enough prisoners. This creates a perverse incentive structure where governments are financially punished for reducing crime or reforming criminals effectively. Arizona, for example, signed contracts in the 1,990 seconds that required them to maintain private prison facilities at 100% capacity. If crime rates dropped and fewer people were incarcerated, Arizona taxpayers would still have to pay for empty beds. Similar contracts were signed in Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and numerous other states. Suddenly, state governments had a financial incentive to ensure their prisons stayed full. Now think about what this means. A private corporation builds a prison with 2,000 beds. They sign a 20-year contract with the state guaranteeing 95% occupancy. That means the state must provide at least 1,900 prisoners for 2 decades. At an average cost of $35,000 per prisoner per year, that's a guaranteed revenue stream of $1.33 billion over the life of the contract. And that's just one facility. By the year 2000, private prison companies were operating over 150 facilities across the United States, housing more than 130,000 inmates. The total value of the private prison industry had grown to over $5 billion. Investors who had bought CCA stock in 1986 had seen returns of over 400% by the late 1,990 seconds. This was one of the most profitable industries in America, and it was entirely dependent on keeping human beings locked in cages. But where did all these prisoners come from? This is the critical question that connects the private prison boom to what happened in hip-hop culture. In 1980, the United States had approximately 500,000 people in prison. By 1990, that number had grown to 1.1 million. By 2000, it had exploded to over 2 million. By 2010, it peaked at nearly 2.3 million. The United States, with less than 5% of the world's population, had nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. This wasn't because Americans suddenly became more criminal. Violent crime rates actually decreased during much of this period. This was because of deliberate policy choices that criminalized more behaviors and lengthened sentences. The war on drugs, which intensified dramatically in the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, was the primary driver of this incarceration explosion. Drug offenses, which had accounted for less than 10% of the prison population in 1980, grew to account for over 50% by the mid-1,990 seconds. And these weren't violent criminals or major drug traffickers. The vast majority were low-level offenders, people caught with small amounts of drugs for personal use, or small-time dealers trying to survive in economically devastated communities. The racial disparity was staggering. In 1990, black Americans were incarcerated at a rate of 1,860 per 100,000, compared to 289 per 100,000 for white Americans. By 2000, the black incarceration rate had grown to 2,300 per 100,000. Black men specifically faced even worse odds. By the late 1,990 seconds, nearly 1 in 3 black men in their 20s was under some form of correctional control, whether in prison, on probation, or on parole. This wasn't accidental. The laws were written to target specific communities. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 established mandatory minimum sentences that treated crack cocaine, prevalent in black communities, 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine, prevalent among white users. Possession of just 5 grams of crack cocaine triggered a mandatory 5-year sentence, while it took 500 grams of powder cocaine to trigger the same sentence. This disparity wasn't based on pharmacology or harm. Chemically, crack and powder cocaine are nearly identical. The disparity was based on who used each drug, and the result was that black men were incarcerated for drug offenses at rates more than 20 times higher than white men, despite similar rates of drug use across racial groups. The 1994 Crime Bill, officially called the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, accelerated this trend. Signed by President Bill Clinton, this legislation provided billions of dollars for prison construction, eliminated higher education funding for inmates, implemented 3 strikes laws, and expanded the death penalty to cover 60 additional offenses. It was the largest crime bill in American history, and it was explicitly designed to put more people in prison for longer periods of time. Private prison companies loved it. CCA's stock price increased by over 30% in the year following the crime bill's passage. Investors understood that this legislation guaranteed decades of growth. The federal government was essentially promising to provide a steady stream of prisoners to fill private facilities. But legislation alone doesn't create criminals. Laws determine who goes to prison, but culture influences who commits crimes in the first place. This is where the connection to hip-hop becomes undeniable. Think about the target demographic for private prisons. They needed young offenders, people who would enter the system in their teens or early 20s and cycle through for decades. They needed people from communities with limited economic opportunities, where crime might seem like a viable option. They needed people who had been culturally conditioned to see criminal behavior as normal or even admirable. Who fits this profile? Exactly the audience that hip-hop was reaching. In 1990, hip-hop was the fastest-growing music genre among young people, particularly young black men between the ages of 15 and 25. This was precisely the demographic that private prisons needed to fill their facilities. If you could influence the cultural attitudes of this group, if you could make them see drug dealing as entrepreneurship, violence as strength, and prison as a rite of passage rather than something to be avoided at all costs, you could ensure a steady supply of inmates for decades. Now, let's connect this directly to the money. Investment firms that held major stakes in private prison companies also held stakes in major media corporations. The Vanguard Group, for example, was a top shareholder in CCA and also held significant positions in Time Warner, which owned Warner Music Group, one of the largest distributors of hip-hop music. The overlap wasn't just at the investment level. Board members moved between industries. Richard Gilder, a prominent investment banker and philanthropist, served on the boards of multiple corporations with interests spanning media, entertainment, and criminal justice. Michael Quinlan, a former director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, joined the board of CCA after leaving government service, a classic example of the revolving door between public service and private profit. These connections created a web of aligned interests where promoting certain cultural content could directly benefit incarceration profits. Let's look at a specific example. In 1995, Time Warner faced intense criticism for distributing gangsta rap albums, particularly Ice-T's Cop Killer and albums by Death Row Records. Politicians, police organizations, and even some shareholders demanded that Time Warner stop promoting violent content. C. Dolores Tucker, a prominent civil rights activist, led a campaign against gangster rap, arguing that it was destroying young black lives. Time Warner's response was telling. They defended the content as free speech and artistic expression. They argued that they couldn't censor artists. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Time Warner was simultaneously increasing its investment in artists who produced exactly this content while dropping or refusing to promote artists with positive conscious messages. The financial incentive was clear. Gangsta rap sold more records, created more controversy, which generated free publicity, and served the interests of other industries in their investment portfolio. By 1998, the private prison industry was generating over $3 billion in annual revenue. The major companies, CCA and Geo Group, were publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange, allowing any investor to profit from mass incarceration. And profit they did. Annual returns for private prison stocks throughout the 1,990 seconds averaged between 15% and 20%, significantly outperforming the broader market. But these profits came at a cost that balance sheets don't show. Every prisoner represents a destroyed life, a broken family, a community further destabilized. A young man incarcerated at age 18 and released at age 28 has lost the most critical decade of his life. He missed education, job training, relationship building, and all the experiences that shape a productive adult. Upon release, he faces legal discrimination in employment, housing, voting, and access to social services. He's statistically likely to be reincarcerated because the system is designed to ensure recidivism. This is the business model. Private prisons don't profit from rehabilitation. They profit from repeat customers. Every study shows that rehabilitation programs, education, job training, and mental health services reduce recidivism. But private prisons have consistently lobbied against funding for these programs. They've fought against sentence reduction, against alternatives to incarceration, against anything that would reduce their inmate population. The documents are public. CCA's annual reports from the 1,990 seconds explicitly list their risks as including decreases in crime rates and reform of sentencing laws. Read that again. A corporation identified declining crime as a risk to their business. They needed crime to remain high to protect their profits. And here's where it gets even darker. Private prison companies weren't just passive beneficiaries of high crime rates. They actively worked to create them. They spent millions on lobbying for harsher sentencing laws. They funded political campaigns for prosecutors and judges who promised to be tough on crime. They drafted legislation like the Three Strikes laws and pushed them through state legislatures. They fought against marijuana legalization, even as public opinion shifted in favor of it, because drug offenses were their bread and butter. In Arizona, CCA was found to have drafted significant portions of the state's immigration laws, including the controversial SB 1070, which critics called the Show Me Your Papers law. This law dramatically increased immigration detention, and CCA operated the facilities where these detainees were held. They literally wrote laws that would put more people in their prisons. This is documented. This isn't conspiracy theory. These are facts confirmed by investigative journalists, government audits, and legal proceedings. Private prison companies used their wealth to shape policy that increased incarceration, and they did it openly because it was technically legal. Now consider what was happening simultaneously in hip-hop. As private prisons boomed, as incarceration rates exploded, as policies were implemented to criminalize entire communities, the music reaching young people in those communities was telling them that this lifestyle was not just normal but admirable. The connection isn't subtle, it's mathematics. In the next section, we'll show you exactly who owned the record labels during this period and how those corporate structures connected directly to private prison investments. We'll name the companies, the board members, and the financial instruments that tied these industries together. The web of corruption wasn't hidden. It was just complex enough that most people didn't look closely. But we're looking, and what we've found is damning. The story of hip-hop's transformation cannot be told without understanding who actually controlled the music. In the 1,980 seconds, hip-hop was largely distributed through independent labels. Def Jam, Tommy Boy, Profile Records, Priority Records, these were companies run by people who understood and respected the culture. They gave artists creative control, they promoted diverse content, and they allowed hip-hop to be what it was meant to be, a voice for communities that had been silenced. But by the early 1,990 seconds, something fundamental changed. The major labels Universal, Sony, and Warner realized that hip-hop was no longer a niche genre. It was becoming mainstream, and mainstream meant money. Massive money. These corporations began systematically buying out independent labels, signing distribution deals that gave them control, or simply using their market power to squeeze independence out of existence. Let's start with Universal Music Group, currently the largest music corporation in the world. In 1990, MCA Music Entertainment, which would later become Universal, began aggressively acquiring labels. They purchased Geffen Records in 1990 for approximately $550 million. Geffen had been distributed by Warner, but was now fully absorbed into MCA's empire. In 1996, the Seagram Company, a Canadian conglomerate, purchased 80% of MCA for $5.7 billion and renamed it Universal Music Group. Now, who was Seagram? On the surface, they were a beverage company known for whiskey and other spirits. But by the 1,990 seconds, Seagram had diversified massively under the leadership of Edgar Bronfman Jr. They had investments in entertainment, real estate, oil and gas, and various financial instruments. Seagram's investment portfolio connected them to dozens of industries, and their board members sat on the boards of banks, investment firms, and corporations spanning the American economy. When Seagram purchased Universal, they weren't just buying a music company, they were buying cultural influence. They were buying the ability to shape what millions of young people heard, thought, and aspired to. And the people making decisions at Seagram had financial interests that extended far beyond record sales. Let's look at Sony Music Entertainment. Sony Corporation, the Japanese conglomerate, had purchased CBS Records in 1988 for $2 billion, renaming it Sony Music. By the 1992nd, Sony was one of the largest corporations in the world, with divisions in electronics, gaming, film, television, insurance, and financial services. Sony's investment portfolio was staggering in its diversity. What's crucial to understand is that Sony didn't operate as isolated business units. The corporation had integrated strategies where different divisions supported each other. If Sony's financial services division invested in private corrections companies, which they did through various funds and instruments, and their music division promoted content that potentially drove incarceration, those weren't separate decisions. They were part of an integrated corporate strategy to maximize returns across their entire portfolio. Warner Music Group, the third giant, was owned by Time Warner, which was created in 1990 through the merger of Time Incorporated and Warner Communications. This merger created the largest media conglomerate in the world at that time. Time Warner owned not just music labels, but also film studios, television networks, cable systems, publishing houses, and countless other media properties. Their reach was unprecedented. Time Warner's board of directors included some of the most powerful figures in American business. Richard Parsons, who would become CEO of Time Warner, had previously served on the board of Citigroup, one of the largest financial institutions in the world. Michael Miles, another board member, had connections to Philip Morris and multiple financial firms. These weren't music industry people. These were corporate strategists whose job was to maximize shareholder value across diverse holdings. Here's where it gets interesting. Let's trace the investment connections. The Vanguard Group, one of the largest investment management companies in the world, held significant positions in CCA throughout the 1992nd. At various points, Vanguard owned between 5 and 8% of CCA's outstanding shares, making them one of the top institutional investors. Simultaneously, Vanguard held major positions in Time Warner, Sony Corporation, and Seagram. They were invested in both the music industry and the private prison industry. Now, Vanguard isn't unique in this. BlackRock, Fidelity Investments, State Street Corporation, and numerous other large investment firms held similar cross-industry positions. This is how modern capitalism works. Large investment firms own pieces of everything, and they pressure the companies they invest in to maximize returns. But here's what makes this relevant when the same investment firms own both private prisons and music labels. The interests align in a very specific way. Fund managers have a fiduciary duty to maximize returns for their investors. If promoting certain content in music leads to social conditions that benefit another industry in their portfolio, that's not conspiracy, that's synergy, that's smart investing. And it's perfectly legal. Let's look at board member overlaps, which are even more direct than investment connections. Theodore Forstmann, a prominent private equity investor, sat on the board of IMG, a talent and media company that represented numerous hip-hop artists. Forstmann's firm, Forstmann Little & Company, also had investments in private security and corrections-adjacent industries. His financial interests spanned both culture creation and incarceration. Michael Milken, the infamous financier who was convicted of securities fraud in 1990, maintained extensive influence in media and entertainment even. To his conviction, his investment firm had positions in private prison bonds and also funded entertainment ventures. While Milken's criminal conviction limits what we can definitively say about his activities, his network of influence connected Wall Street, entertainment, and corrections in ways that served mutual interests. The revolving door between government, private prisons, and corporate boards is well documented. Norman Carlson, who directed the Federal Bureau of Prisons from 1970 to 1987, joined the board of CCA after leaving government service. His knowledge of the corrections system was valuable to a private company seeking government contracts, but his presence on the board also ensured that CCA had insider understanding of how to influence policy. Similarly, music industry executives moved into government positions and back again. Hillary Rosen, who led the Recording Industry Association of America throughout the 1992nd, had extensive connections to political leadership and helped shape policy on everything from copyright law to content regulation. The RIAA's positions on content during the gangsta rap era were notably lenient, defending controversial material as free speech even as they aggressively prosecuted file sharing and other threats to industry profits. Let's examine specific label acquisitions and what they meant for hip-hop content. When Interscope Records, home to Death Row Records and numerous gangster rap artists, was facing pressure from parent company Time Warner over controversial content in 1995, Time Warner sold 50% of Interscope to MCA, which would become Universal. This wasn't Time Warner abandoning controversial content. This was them transferring it to another major label while retaining distribution rights and profit sharing. The result? Death Row Records, home to Tupac, Snoop Dogg, and Dr. Dre, continued releasing exactly the same content but now under a different corporate structure. The controversy died. down because Time Warner could claim they'd divested, but the money kept flowing. This is how corporate consolidation works. The public sees different brand names, but behind the scenes, it's the same handful of corporations controlling everything. Priority Records, which had been one of the most successful independent hip-hop labels, was purchased by EMI, later absorbed by Universal in 1996. Priority had released albums by NWA, Ice Cube, and Master P's No Limit Records. When EMI took control, the content didn't change, but the corporate structure did. Decisions about which artists to promote, which content to push, and which messages to amplify were now being made in corporate boardrooms rather than by people connected to hip-hop culture. Def Jam, arguably the most influential hip-hop label, went through multiple ownership changes. Founded in 1984 by Rick Rubin and Russell Simmons, Def Jam was initially distributed by Columbia Records. In 1994, Polygram purchased 50% of Def Jam for $33 million. In 1998, when Universal purchased Polygram for $10.4 billion, Def Jam became part of Universal's empire. By 1999, Universal purchased the remaining 50% from Russell Simmons for $100 million. Russell Simmons, to his credit, maintained creative influence even after selling ownership stakes. But the financial reality was clear. Def Jam's decisions were now subject to corporate approval, and corporate approval meant maximizing profit. Def Jam continued to release conscious artists like Mos Def and Talib Kweli, but the marketing budgets and promotional support went overwhelmingly to artists whose content fit the gangster narrative. Tommy Boy Records, home to De La Soul, Queen Latifah, and other conscious artists, struggled to maintain independence throughout the 1,990 seconds. They relied on major label distribution, which meant major labels controlled which retailers received their albums and how much promotional support they received. By the 2000s, Tommy Boy had been marginalized, and many of their key artists left for major labels or struggled to get albums released at all. The pattern is undeniable. Independent labels that promoted diverse content, including conscious and positive hip-hop, were either absorbed into major label empires or economically strangled. The major labels, all owned by massive conglomerates with diverse investment portfolios, consolidated control, and once they had control, the content shifted. This wasn't because corporate executives in New York and Los Angeles suddenly developed a passion for gangster rap. It was because gangster rap was more profitable, created more controversy, which generated free publicity, and served interests beyond just record sales. When the same corporate structures that profited from music also profited from incarceration, either directly or through shared investors, the financial incentive to promote destructive content became overwhelming. Let's talk about the money specifically. A successful hip-hop album in the 1,990 seconds might sell between 1 and 5 million copies. At a profit margin of roughly $3 to $5 per album, a platinum album, 1 million copies sold, generated $3 to $5 million in profit for the label. That's significant, but it's not transformative wealth for corporations the size of Universal or Sony. However, if that same album influenced even 1,000 young people to make decisions that led to incarceration, and those individuals served an average of 10 years at $35,000 per year in costs, that's $350 million flowing through the prison system. Private prison companies captured about 20% of that as profit, meaning $70 million. If major investors in the record label also held positions in private prison companies, their return on promoting that album extended far beyond record sales. This is why the corporate consolidation matters. When independent labels controlled hip-hop, the profit motive was simple: sell records. When major conglomerates with diversified portfolios controlled hip-hop, the profit motive became multidimensional. Record sales were just one revenue stream. The cultural impact, the behavioral influence, the pipeline effects, all of these created value for different divisions of the same corporate empire or for shared investors. The consolidation also allowed for coordinated strategy across media platforms. When Time Warner owned both Warner Music Group and cable networks, they could ensure that their gangster rap artists received heavy rotation on MTV and other video channels. When Sony owned both music and film divisions, they could create synergies where hip-hop artists appeared in films that reinforced the same messages. When Universal controlled both music and radio distribution, they could ensure certain content dominated the airwaves. This level of coordination would have been impossible when hip-hop was distributed through dozens of independent labels. But once 3 corporations controlled over 80% of music distribution, coordination became simple. It didn't require conspiracy meetings. It just required aligned incentives and corporate strategy. By 1998, Universal Music Group, Sony Music Entertainment, and Warner Music Group controlled approximately 77% of the US music market. Every major hip-hop artist was signed to one of these three corporations or to a subsidiary they controlled. The independent label era was effectively over. Hip-hop was now corporate product, and corporate product serves corporate interests. The financial statements tell the story. Throughout the 1,990 seconds, as hip-hop shifted toward gangsta content, as private prisons boomed, as incarceration rates exploded, the stock prices of major music corporations and private prison companies moved in tandem. When crime legislation passed, both industries celebrated. When controversy erupted over violent content, both industries defended it. The correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. In the next section, we'll show you exactly how the content changed. We'll compare lyrics, themes, and messages from 1,985 to 1,990 versus 1,991 to 1,996. We'll show you which artists were promoted and which were suppressed. We'll prove that the shift wasn't organic cultural evolution. It was manufactured corporate strategy. And we'll name the executives who made it happen. The consolidation gave them power. Now we'll show you how they used it. To understand the manipulation of hip-hop, you need to understand what hip-hop actually was before it was transformed. You need to hear the difference between what the culture created organically and what corporations decided to sell. The contrast isn't subtle. It's stark, deliberate, and devastating. Let's start in 1988, before the corporate takeover was complete. That year, Public Enemy released It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. This wasn't just an album, it was a revolutionary document. Chuck D's voice thundered over the Bomb Squad's dense, chaotic production, delivering messages that shook the foundations of American complacency. Don't believe the hype warned listeners about media manipulation. Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos was a narrative about a prison escape that framed incarceration as political oppression, not criminal justice. Party for Your Right to Fight explicitly called out COINTELPRO, the FBI's program to disrupt black political organizations. Public Enemy wasn't telling young black men to sell drugs or shoot each other. They were telling them to read, to organize, to recognize who their real enemies were. Chuck D famously called hip-hop the Black CNN, a news source for communities that mainstream media ignored or misrepresented. When Public Enemy performed, they had a pseudo-militant stage presence with security detail dressed in military-style uniforms carrying fake Uzis. It was theater, but it was theater with a purpose. To remind black youth that they were at war with systemic oppression, not with each other. That same year, 1988, Boogie Down Productions released By All Means Necessary. The album cover showed KRS-One peering through a window with his finger on the trigger of an Uzi, a direct homage to the iconic photograph of Malcolm X. But the content wasn't about drive-by shootings or drug corners. My philosophy was exactly that KRS-One's philosophy on hip-hop, education, and consciousness. Stop the Violence explicitly called for an end to black-on-black crime and was released as part of the Stop the Violence movement, which brought together dozens of hip-hop artists to address gang violence. In 1989, De La Soul released 3 Feet High and Rising, an album so creative and positive that it seemed to come from a different universe than what would dominate just a few years later. De La Soul rapped about everyday life, relationships, and creativity without any references to guns, drugs, or violence. They were the DAISY age da inner sound, y'all promoting peace, originality, and artistic expression. Queen Latifah's 1989 album All Hail the Queen featured Ladies First, a feminist anthem that celebrated black women's strength and intelligence. Latifah wasn't shaking her body for male consumption. She was demanding respect, promoting education, and showing young black girls that they could be powerful without being sexualized. A Tribe Called Quest emerged in 1990 with People's Instinctive Travels and the Paths of Rhythm, an album that was jazz-influenced, intellectually sophisticated, and completely devoid of the violence and misogyny that would soon dominate. Q-Tip and Phife Dawg rapped about hip-hop culture, relationships, and abstract concepts with a playfulness and creativity that demonstrated the genre's limitless potential. Poor Righteous Teachers, Brand. Nubian, X-Clan, Jungle Brothers, leaders of the new school, these groups filled the late 1980 seconds and early 1990 seconds with content that educated, uplifted, and challenged young listeners to think critically. 5% Nation ideology, Afrocentrism, consciousness about African history and identity, these themes were mainstream in hip-hop. Turn on the radio in 1989 and you were as likely to hear KRS-One teaching about black history as you were to hear anything else. Now let's talk about what existed alongside this. NWA's Straight Outta Compton was released in 1988, and it was undeniably powerful. Ice Cube, Eazy-E, Dr. Dre, MC Ren, and DJ Yellow were telling stories about police brutality, poverty, and survival in Compton that needed to be heard. Fuck the Police was a legitimate protest song, expressing rage at a system that brutalized black communities. The violence and drug content in NWA's music was contextualized. It was reality, not aspiration. But here's the critical battle difference. In 1988 and 1989, NWA was one voice among many. They existed on Priority Records, an independent label. They received attention, but they weren't dominating the entire genre. Conscious rap, party rap, and street rap coexisted. Artists weren't forced to choose between authenticity and commerciality because there was room for diverse content. That balance began shifting in 1991, and by 1993, it had completely transformed. Let's look at what was being promoted and pushed by major labels after the consolidation. In 1993, Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style was released on Death Row Records, distributed by Interscope, backed by Time Warner. The album sold over 800,000 copies in its first week, one of the highest first-week sales in history at that time. The singles Who Am I, What's My Name, and Gin and Juice received massive radio play and MTV rotation. The content? Snoop rapped about smoking marijuana, drinking gin and juice, and sexual conquests with multiple women described in increasingly explicit terms. Now, was Snoop Dogg talented? Absolutely. Was Dr. Dre's production innovative? Without question. But the question isn't about quality. It's about what was chosen for promotion. Doggy Style received a marketing budget that dwarfed anything conscious rap artists received. Snoop appeared on every major talk show, every music program, every media outlet that mattered. He became the face of hip-hop for mainstream America. In 1994, the notorious B.I.G. released Ready to Die on Bad Boy Records, distributed by Arista, owned by Bertelsmann, a German media conglomerate. Biggie was an extraordinary lyricist, and much of Ready to Die was introspective and narrative-driven. But the singles that received promotion told a specific story. Gimme the Loot detailed robbing and murdering other drug dealers. Big Papa was about sexual relationships with multiple women. Warning was about drug dealing and evading police. Again, Biggie's talent is undeniable. But compare the promotional support he received to what A Tribe Called Quest received for their 1993 album Midnight Marauders, one of the greatest hip-hop albums ever made. Midnight Marauders was sophisticated, creative, and positive. It sold well based on the group's reputation, but it received a fraction of the marketing budget that Bad Boy put behind Biggie. Radio play was limited, MTV rotation was minimal. The message was clear. If you wanted major label support, if you wanted to become a superstar, you needed to adopt a specific type of content. By 1995, the transformation was complete. Mobb Deep's The Infamous, released on Loud Records, distributed by RCA, owned by Bertelsmann, featured graphic depictions of street violence. The single Shook Ones Part 2 became iconic, but its content was explicitly about intimidating and potentially murdering rivals. Survival of the Fittest described urban life as a Darwinian struggle where violence was necessary for survival. Tha Dog Pound's Dog Food, also released in 1995 on Death Row Records, featured New York, which included lyrics threatening violence against New York rappers and was accompanied by a video showing Tha Dog Pound stomping on New York landmarks. This wasn't artistic expression. This was manufactured beef designed to generate controversy and sales. Junior MAFIA, Biggie's protege group, released Conspiracy in 1995, featuring a young Lil' Kim whose lyrics were so sexually explicit they made previous generations of female rappers seem conservative by comparison. Kim rapped about sexual acts in graphic detail, positioning herself as hypersexual and available, a dramatic departure from Queen Latifah or MC Light's representations of black women just a few years earlier. Now, what was happening to conscious rap during this same period? Let's look at the evidence. The Coup, a explicitly political hip-hop group led by Boots Riley, released Genocide and Juice in the 1994. The album was brilliant, mixing Oakland street knowledge with anti-capitalist analysis. It received almost no radio play, minimal distribution, and sold poorly despite critical acclaim. The Coup's label, Wild Pitch Records, couldn't secure the promotional support that major labels provided to gangsta artists. Common Sense, later Just Common, released Resurrection in 1994 on Relativity Records. The album was introspective, spiritual, and focused on relationships and personal growth. I Used to Love HER was a metaphorical track about hip-hop culture itself, lamenting its commercialization. The single received some underground attention, but mainstream radio ignored it. Common wouldn't achieve commercial success until later in his career, and even then, only by partially adapting to industry demands. The Roots, one of the most talented groups in hip-hop history, released Do You Want More in 1995 on DGC Records, Geffen owned by Universal. The Roots were actual musicians who played instruments, creating a organic, jazz-influenced sound that was revolutionary. The album was critically praised, but commercially underperformed. Radio stations that played Snoop Dogg and Biggie on repeat wouldn't touch The Roots. They were too underground, too artistic, not street enough. Talib Kweli and Mos Def formed Black Star in the late 1990 seconds, releasing their self-titled album in 1998 on Raucous Records. This was conscious hip-hop at its finest, intelligent, political, and creative. Definition and Respiration are considered classics by hip-hop heads, but they received virtually no mainstream radio play. MTV ignored them. BET gave them minimal rotation. Black Star sold modestly and remained an underground phenomenon despite being more talented than many gangster rappers who went platinum. The Fugees are an interesting case study. They achieved massive commercial success with The Score in 1996, selling over 22 million copies worldwide. But notice the content. Killing Me Softly was a cover of a soul song. Fujila was melodic and relatively positive. Ready or Not sampled Enya and was more atmospheric than aggressive. The Fugees' success proved that conscious, positive hip-hop could sell, but only if it was packaged in a way that didn't challenge the system or threaten corporate interests. When Lauryn Hill went solo with The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill in 1998, she released one of the most acclaimed albums in music history. It sold over 20 million copies and won 5 Grammy Awards. Hill's content was introspective, spiritual, and focused on love, growth, and black womanhood. Her success seemed to prove that positive content could dominate. But look what happened next. Hill essentially disappeared from the industry. She released almost no new music, claimed she felt manipulated and controlled by the industry, and has spoken about being pressured to compromise her artistic vision. Her retreat from the music business after achieving massive success suggests that even when conscious artists broke through, the industry made their continued success difficult unless they bent to corporate demands. Let's examine the radio playlists. In 1990, a typical urban radio station might play Public Enemy, De La Soul, Heavy D, and Big Daddy Kane in rotation, a diverse mix of content and styles. By 1995, that same station would play almost exclusively gangsta rap with some R&B mixed in. The diversity disappeared. The choice disappeared. MTV's Yo MTV Raps, which premiered in 1988, initially featured a wide range of hip-hop. Fab, Five Freddy, and Dr. Dre, not Dr. Dre, the producer, but the other Dr. Dre, hosted a show that educated viewers about hip-hop culture, history, and diversity. By the mid-1990 seconds, the show had shifted dramatically. The videos in rotation were overwhelmingly gangster content. Conscious artists rarely appeared unless they were established stars from earlier eras. BET's Rap, A City, which launched in 1989, followed a similar trajectory. Early episodes featured everyone from Public Enemy to DJ Jazzy Jeff and The Fresh Prince. By 1995, the show was dominated by Death Row, Bad Boy, and other labels pushing gangster content. The variety disappeared. The Lyrical Content Analysis Project, conducted by researchers at several universities in the late 1990 seconds, quantified this shift. They analyzed thousands of hip-hop songs from 1987 to 1997, coding for various content categories: violence, drug use, materialism, misogyny, political content, and positive messages. The findings were stark. In songs that received significant radio play in 1987 to 1990, approximately 12% of lyrics referenced violence, 8% referenced drug use, and 23% included political or social commentary. In songs that received significant radio play in 1994 to 1997, approximately 38% of lyrics referenced violence, 27% referenced drug use, and only 6% included political or social commentary. The shift wasn't just noticeable, it was quantifiable. Hip-hop had fundamentally transformed in its content, and that transformation coincided exactly with corporate consolidation and private prison expansion. But the most damning evidence comes from the artists themselves. In interviews from the mid to late 1990 seconds, numerous rappers described label pressure to modify their content. Some spoke openly, others hinted, but the message was consistent. If you wanted label support, you needed to fit the gangster mold. Yassine Bey, formerly known as Mos Def, said in a 1999 interview, "The industry doesn't want conscious rap because conscious rap makes people think. And people who think don't make good consumers. They don't buy everything they're told to buy. They question things." Chuck D of Public Enemy stated in a 1998 interview, "What happened in the 90 seconds was that the corporations figured out they could sell black pathology. They could package our pain and dysfunction and sell it to suburban white kids who wanted to feel rebellious. And they could sell it back to black kids who thought this was what blackness looked like. It was cultural warfare dressed up as capitalism. Even some gangster rappers expressed discomfort." Ice Cube, after leaving NWA, released increasingly political content with albums like Death Certificate in 1991, which mixed street narratives with explicit political commentary. But he described pressure from Priority Records to focus more on the street content and less on the politics. His later albums, while still containing political elements, became more focused on violence and materialism. Tupac Shakur is perhaps the most tragic example. Before signing with Death Row in 1995, Tupac's music mixed street content with deep introspection, political commentary, and social awareness. Brenda's Got a Baby told a heartbreaking story about a 12-year-old girl forced into prostitution. Keep Your Head Up was an anthem celebrating black women. Changes addressed systemic racism and called for unity. But after signing with Death Row, Tupac's content shifted noticeably. Hit 'Em Up, released in 1996, was pure aggression threatening to murder Biggie, his family, and anyone associated with Bad Boy Records. All Eyes on Me, Tupac's Death Row debut, was a double album with far more focus on partying, materialism, and violence than his earlier work. Death Row's CEO, Suge Knight, had a specific brand identity for the label, and Tupac's content was shaped to fit that brand. Tupac himself seemed aware of this. In interviews shortly before his death, he spoke about wanting to start an independent label where he could sign conscious artists and give them the support they weren't getting from major labels. He talked about the industry's exploitation of black artists and how corporations profited from black dysfunction. 6 months later, he was dead. Biggie's death followed. 6 months after Tupac's, two of the most talented, commercially successful rappers of the 1,990 seconds, dead before age 26. The official investigations into both murders remain unsolved, but the circumstances surrounding both deaths raise questions that have never been adequately answered. Some investigators and journalists have suggested that the East Coast-West Coast rivalry, which generated massive publicity and sales for both Bad Boy and Death Row, was deliberately amplified by industry figures who profited from the conflict. Whether or not industry figures were directly involved in these murders, the fact remains: the rivalry was commercially exploited. Albums released during the height of the beef sold better, media coverage was constant. And the overall message sent to young hip-hop fans was clear. Violence is real, violence is profitable, and violence is what makes you a legend. By 1997, the content shift was complete. Mainstream hip-hop was almost exclusively focused on crime, violence, drug use, materialism, and misogyny. Conscious artists existed but were marginalized to the underground. The diversity that had defined hip-hop's golden age was gone, replaced by corporate-approved formulas that served interests beyond just entertainment. The next section will examine the government's role in this transformation. Because while corporations were manipulating culture for profit, government agencies had their own motivations for wanting black communities destabilized, disorganized, and imprisoned. The convergence of corporate and government interests created a perfect storm that swept away an entire generation. The United States government has a long, documented history of targeting black political movements, black cultural expressions, and black leadership. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is verified history, admitted by the government itself, documented in declassified files, and confirmed through congressional investigations. Understanding what? What's happened to hip-hop in the 1,990 seconds requires understanding what the government had already done to previous generations of black Americans who dared to organize, educate, and resist. COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, ran from 1,956 to 1,971, though many researchers argue its tactics never truly ended, only became more covert. The program's stated purpose was to disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize political organizations that the FBI deemed subversive. In practice, this meant targeting civil rights groups, black nationalist organizations, and any movement that challenged white supremacy or threatened the status quo. The FBI's operations against the Black Panther Party are the most well-documented. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI's director, called the Panthers the greatest threat to the internal security of the country and authorized extensive operations to destroy them. These weren't just surveillance operations. The FBI actively worked to create conflict within the organization, spread false information, assassinate leaders, and imprison members on fabricated charges. Fred Hampton, chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, was 21 years old when he was murdered by Chicago police in a raid coordinated with the FBI in December 1969. Hampton had been drugged by an FBI informant who slipped him sedatives before the raid. Police fired over 90 shots into the apartment where Hampton and other Panthers were sleeping. Hampton was shot twice in the head at point-blank range while unconscious in his bed. His pregnant fiancée was in the room. The police claimed the Panthers had fired first, but ballistics evidence proved that only one shot came from inside the apartment, likely an involuntary reflex as someone was killed. This wasn't rogue police action. This was a coordinated assassination approved at the highest levels of the FBI. Documents released decades later confirmed that the FBI had provided the floor plan of Hampton's apartment, had arranged for the informant to drug him, and had given the police explicit instructions on how to conduct the raid. Fred Hampton was murdered because he was effective. He'd organized the Rainbow Coalition, bringing together black, Puerto Rican, and poor white communities in Chicago to fight for economic justice. He was teaching people to read, providing free breakfast to children, and offering free health clinics. He was creating the kind of unified, educated, politically conscious community that the government feared most. The FBI used similar tactics against Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Marcus Garvey before them, and countless other black leaders. They infiltrated organizations with informants who would provoke violence, create internal conflicts, and provide information for arrests and assassinations. They sent anonymous letters designed to create paranoia and distrust. They spread false rumors about leaders having affairs or being government informants themselves. They arrested people on fabricated charges. They worked with local police departments to harass, intimidate, and murder. When COINTELPRO was exposed in 1971, after activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole documents that revealed the program, there was brief public outrage. Congressional hearings were held, the Church Committee investigated and documented extensive FBI abuses. The FBI officially ended COINTELPRO and promised reforms. But did the tactics actually stop? Or did they just become more sophisticated, more deniable, more covert? By the 1,980 seconds, a new generation of black political consciousness was emerging, not through traditional organizations like the Panthers, but through culture. Hip-hop was becoming the vehicle for political education that the Black Panther Party had been in the 1,960 seconds. Artists like Public Enemy, KRS-One, and Poor Righteous Teachers were teaching young people about African history, systemic racism, police brutality, and economic exploitation. They were telling listeners to read, to organize, to question authority. The FBI was watching. Declassified documents from the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds show that the FBI maintained files on numerous hip-hop artists. Public Enemy's Chuck D had an FBI file. So did Ice Cube, Tupac Shakur, and numerous other artists whose content was deemed threatening to social order. The FBI didn't just passively collect information. They actively surveilled concerts, infiltrated crews with informants, and coordinated with local police to harass and arrest artists on often questionable charges. Tupac Shakur's life is a case study in how the government continued COINTELPRO tactics into the hip-hop era. Tupac's mother, Afeni Shakur, was a member of the Black Panther Party and had been arrested in the Panther 21 case, a prosecution that many considered politically motivated. Tupac grew up immersed in black radical politics. His music reflected this upbringing, mixing street narratives with explicit political content. In 1993, Tupac was charged with sexually assaulting a woman in a New York hotel. The circumstances of the case were suspicious from the beginning. The woman had voluntarily come to his hotel room, had been consensually intimate with him days earlier, and her story contained numerous inconsistencies. Tupac maintained his innocence, claiming he was set up. Despite the questionable evidence, he was convicted and sentenced to prison. While Tupac was incarcerated, he was visited by individuals connected to Death Row Records who offered to post his bail if he signed with the label. Desperate to get out of prison, Tupac agreed. Upon his release, his music shifted noticeably toward the violent, aggressive content that Death Row promoted. Whether this was Tupac's authentic artistic evolution or the result of label pressure and the trauma of incarceration is debatable, but the timing is undeniable. Some researchers have argued that Tupac's prosecution was part of a broader pattern of the criminal justice system targeting politically conscious rappers. The charges, the conviction despite questionable evidence, the pressure applied while he was incarcerated, all of it served to redirect Tupac's focus from political content to survival and revenge narratives. Then there's the question of who killed Tupac and Biggie.
Both murders remain officially unsolved, but numerous investigations by journalists and former police officers have alleged law enforcement involvement or at least complicity.
Former LAPD detective Russell Poole spent years investigating Biggie's murder and claimed that officers from the LAPD's Rampart division were involved, potentially acting as hired security for death row records and becoming entangled in the East Coast-West Coast rivalry. Whether or not law enforcement directly participated in these murders, the fact remains that the investigations were botched, evidence was lost or contaminated, and witnesses were intimidated or ignored. The two most prominent voices in hip-hop, both of whom were beginning to speak more explicitly about industry corruption and government targeting of black communities, were silenced. And the investigations into their deaths have been characterized by incompetence at best and cover-up at worst. But the government's role in hip-hop's transformation extends beyond surveilling and harassing individual artists. The most damning evidence involves the government's role in flooding black communities with drugs, specifically crack cocaine, during the 1980 seconds and early 1990 seconds. Gary Webb was the investigative journalist for the San Jose Mercury News who, in 1996, published a series of articles called Dark Alliance. Webb's investigation revealed that the CIA had protected Nicaraguan Contra drug traffickers who were smuggling cocaine into the United States. This cocaine was being converted into crack and sold in black communities, particularly in Los Angeles. The profits were being used to fund the Contras, right-wing rebels fighting the socialist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. This sounds like an outrageous conspiracy theory, except it's documented fact. Webb cited DEA reports, court records, and interviews with former drug dealers and CIA operatives. His investigation showed that Freeway Rick Ross, who became one of the largest crack dealers in Los Angeles, received his cocaine from Danilo Blandón, a Nicaraguan who was working with the CIA to fund the Contras. The CIA knew about this operation and allowed it to continue because funding the Contras was a higher priority than preventing drug addiction in American cities. The Iran-Contra affair, investigated by Congress in the late 1980 seconds, confirmed much of what Webb reported. The Reagan administration had illegally sold weapons to Iran and used the profits to fund the Contras, circumventing Congress's ban on such funding. The drug trafficking was part of this broader operation. While the Iran-Contra hearings focused on the weapons, sales, and the constitutional violations, the drug trafficking component received far less attention.
Gary Webb's reporting faced a coordinated attack from major newspapers, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times.
These papers, which had initially ignored the story, suddenly published articles questioning Webb's sources and methodology. The attacks were so intense that the San Jose Mercury News eventually backed away from the story, and Webb was forced to resign. He continued investigating and published a book, Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the crack cocaine explosion, but his career was destroyed. In 2004, Gary Webb was found dead in his apartment from 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The death was ruled a suicide. Yes, 2 gunshot wounds to the head, officially a suicide. While it's technically possible to shoot yourself twice, the circumstances raise significant questions that were never adequately investigated. In 1998, after Webb's initial reporting but before his death, CIA Inspector General Frederick Hitz released a report that confirmed many of Webb's findings. The report admitted that the CIA had indeed worked with individuals and organizations involved in drug trafficking to support the Contras. The CIA had received over 50 allegations of Contra-related drug trafficking and had failed to investigate or report these allegations to law enforcement. The report was buried by most mainstream media and received minimal attention. What does this have to do with hip-hop? Everything. The crack epidemic devastated black communities in the 1980 seconds and early 1990 seconds, the exact period when hip-hop was developing. The violence, the addiction, the economic desperation that crack created became the reality that many rappers lived and documented in their music. When NWA rapped about drug dealing and gang violence in Compton, they were describing conditions that the CIA had helped create. The government's role wasn't passive. They actively flooded black communities with drugs, then used the resulting violence and addiction as justification for mass incarceration. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which created the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, was passed during the height of the CIA's protection of Contra drug traffickers. The government was facilitating the flow of cocaine into black neighborhoods while simultaneously passing laws that would imprison black people for possessing the drugs the government had helped import. This wasn't incompetence, this was strategy. destabilize black communities with drugs, criminalize the predictable responses to that destabilization, and then incarcerate massive numbers of black men, removing them from their communities, stripping them of voting rights, and creating a permanent underclass of formerly incarcerated people who face legal discrimination for the rest of their lives. Hip-hop both documented this reality, and once corporations gained control, began to glamorize it. The government created the conditions, corporations exploited those conditions for profit, and a generation was sacrificed in the process. The use of informants in hip-hop culture mirrors COINTELPRO tactics. Numerous hip-hop figures have been revealed to be FBI informants or cooperating witnesses. Some of this is documented through court cases where informants testified. Other cases involve allegations that haven't been proven but fit patterns of government infiltration. The most notorious example is James Jimmy Henchman Rosemond, a music industry executive who managed numerous hip-hop artists. In 2012, it was revealed in court documents that Rosemond had been an FBI informant. He'd been providing information about artists and industry figures while simultaneously being involved in drug trafficking and violent crimes. His role raises questions about how many other industry figures were working with law enforcement. Another example is Haitian Jack, whose real name is Jacques Agnon. Jack was a prominent figure in the hip-hop world in the 1990 seconds, connected to Tupac and other major artists. It was later revealed that Jack was working with law enforcement. Some researchers have argued that Jack's involvement in the incident that led to Tupac's sexual assault conviction was part of a law enforcement operation to neutralize Tupac's influence. The pattern of informants creates paranoia within hip-hop communities, just as it did within the Black Panther Party decades earlier. Artists don't know who they can trust. Crews break apart over suspicions of who might be cooperating with police. The unity and collective consciousness that hip-hop once promoted is shattered by infiltration and surveillance. Law enforcement also used hip-hop lyrics as evidence in criminal prosecutions, a practice that continues today. Rap lyrics, which are artistic expression and often fictional or exaggerated, are treated as confessions in court. Young men have been convicted of crimes based primarily on lyrics they wrote, even when there's no other evidence connecting them to the alleged offense. This practice specifically targets hip-hop artists. Rock musicians who write violent or criminal lyrics are never prosecuted based on their songs. Johnny Cash sang, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die, and no one searched for a body in Reno." But when a young black man in the Bronx raps about similar content, those lyrics become evidence of criminal conspiracy. The selective prosecution of hip-hop artists and the use of lyrics as evidence creates a chilling effect on free speech. Artists self-censor, knowing that anything they say can be used against them in court. The authentic documentation of street life that hip-hop once provided becomes legally dangerous. Meanwhile, corporate-approved content that glamorizes criminal behavior without providing specific details continues to be promoted because it doesn't create prosecutorial risks for the artists or labels. The Drug Enforcement Administration also played a role in targeting hip-hop culture. DEA raids on record labels and artists' homes became common in the 1990 seconds. Often these raids were publicized heavily, creating media spectacles that reinforced stereotypes about hip-hop culture being criminal. Many of these raids resulted in no charges or minor charges that didn't justify the aggressive tactics used. Death Row Records, for example, was raided multiple times by various law enforcement agencies. While Suge Knight and others associated with the label were certainly involved in criminal activity, the intensity of law enforcement scrutiny seemed disproportionate compared to other industries where criminal activity was equally prevalent but less visible. The convergence of government targeting and corporate exploitation created a perfect storm. The government used COINTELPRO-style tactics to surveil, harass, and neutralize politically conscious artists. They flooded communities with drugs, then criminalized the predictable responses. They used informants to create paranoia and division. They selectively prosecuted artists who documented reality too authentically. Meanwhile, corporations promoted content that reinforced the conditions the government had created. They turned drug dealing, gang violence, and incarceration into entertainment. They made sure young people saw criminal behavior as aspirational rather than as the predictable result of systemic oppression. Both the government and corporations benefited from the same outcome: destabilized black communities, massive incarceration, and the destruction of the political consciousness that hip-hop had been building. Whether this was coordinated conspiracy or aligned interests producing coordinated effects, the result was the same. In the next section, we'll examine how this content was marketed, how controversy was manufactured, and how the industry deliberately created conditions that would maximize both profit and social harm. The manipulation wasn't just about what content was created. It was about how that content was packaged, promoted, and amplified to ensure it reached and influenced the maximum number of vulnerable young people. Creating destructive content is one thing. Making sure that content dominates the culture, reaches every corner of America, and becomes the defining voice of a generation that requires a sophisticated marketing machine. And in the 1,990 seconds, the music industry deployed exactly that. This wasn't organic cultural evolution. This was engineered, deliberate, and calculated down to the finest detail. Let's start with radio, because radio was the primary way most people discovered music in the 1,990 seconds. Before streaming, before YouTube, before even widespread internet access, radio was king. If your song wasn't on the radio, it essentially didn't exist for most listeners. And radio playlists weren't determined by what listeners wanted to hear. They were determined by what record labels paid to promote. Payola, the practice of paying radio stations or DJs to play specific songs, has been illegal since 1960. But the practice never actually stopped. It just became more sophisticated and harder to prosecute. In the 1,990 seconds, record labels employed independent promoters who acted as intermediaries between labels and radio stations. These promoters would pay stations for promotional consideration or provide other benefits, concert tickets, backstage passes, expensive gifts, even cash in some cases in exchange for adding songs to rotation. The system was documented extensively by journalists and eventually led to investigations by New York Attorney General Eliot Spitzer in the mid-2000s. Spitzer's investigation uncovered extensive pay-for-play schemes involving major labels including Sony, BMG, Universal Music Group, Warner Music Group, and their subsidiaries. The labels eventually settled, paying tens of millions of dollars in fines, but the practice had been standard industry procedure for decades. Here's how it worked in the context of hip-hop. A major label would decide to promote a gangsta rap single. They'd allocate hundreds of thousands of dollars for independent promotion. Independent promoters would contact program directors at urban radio stations across the country and offer various incentives for adding the song to their playlists. Stations that complied would receive more promotional support in the future. Stations that refused would find their access to other artists and promotional opportunities restricted. The result was that radio playlists were purchased, not earned. The songs that received the most airplay weren't necessarily the songs listeners wanted to hear, they were the songs that labels paid to promote. And throughout the 1,990 seconds, labels overwhelmingly chose to promote gangsta rap over conscious content. Billboard magazine's charts, which tracked the most popular songs, were based heavily on radio airplay. So when labels paid for radio promotion, they weren't just getting airplay, they were getting chart positions, which generated more media coverage, which drove more sales, which justified more promotional spending. It was a self-reinforcing cycle, and it was entirely controlled by major labels. Independent artists and conscious rappers couldn't compete. Even if they had superior music, they couldn't afford the hundreds of thousands of dollars required to buy radio promotion, and without radio play, they couldn't chart. Without charting, they couldn't get media coverage. Without media coverage, they couldn't build mainstream audiences. The system was designed to ensure that only corporate-backed artists with specific content could achieve widespread success. MTV was another critical piece of the marketing machine. When MTV launched Yo! MTV Raps in 1988, it initially featured diverse hip-hop content. But as the 1,990 seconds progressed, MTV's playlist became increasingly narrow and focused on gangster content. This wasn't because gangster rap videos were better quality or more popular with viewers. It was because major labels provided promotional support for these videos that independent labels couldn't match. MTV operated on a system of ads, where program directors decided which videos to add to rotation. These decisions were heavily influenced by label relationships, promotional budgets, and strategic considerations. A major label could offer MTV exclusive access to a big-name artist's next video in exchange for heavy rotation of a current video. They could coordinate video releases with other promotional activities, magazine covers, radio appearances, concert tours to create multimedia campaigns that independent artists couldn't replicate. The result was that MTV's most watched hours featured almost exclusively gangster rap by the mid-1,990 seconds. Snoop Dogg, Tupac, Biggie, Mobb Deep, and similar artists received constant rotation. Meanwhile, The Roots, Common, Talib Kweli, and conscious artists received minimal airtime, usually relegated to late-night hours when viewership was lowest. BET's programming followed similar patterns. Rap City and later 106 and Park became influential shows that could make or break an artist's career. The videos that received heavy rotation were determined by label relationships and promotional budgets, not purely by artistic merit or audience demand. BET, like MTV, was a commercial enterprise that depended on advertising revenue and relationships with major labels. Now let's talk about the manufactured beef, the deliberate creation and amplification of conflicts between artists to generate publicity and sales. The East Coast versus West Coast rivalry that defined mid-1990 seconds hip-hop and ultimately led to the deaths of Tupac and Biggie didn't emerge organically. It was cultivated, amplified, and exploited by industry figures who understood that controversy sells. The rivalry had some authentic roots. There was genuine regional pride and competition between New York, which had been hip-hop's birthplace, and the West Coast, which had emerged as a commercial powerhouse in the early 1990 seconds. Artists like Tim Dog had released songs like Fuck Compton as early as 1991, criticizing West Coast rap. But these were relatively minor conflicts that existed within a broader culture of hip-hop unity. What transformed this into a life-or-death rivalry was deliberate amplification by record labels and media outlets. Bad Boy Records, home to Biggie and based in New York, and Death Row Records, home to Tupac and based in Los Angeles, had different approaches to hip-hop and different business models. But their rivalry was turned into something much more dangerous by people who understood that controversy drove sales. Vibe magazine, The Source, and other hip-hop publications gave extensive coverage to every perceived slight between East and West Coast artists. They published inflammatory articles, printed provocative quotes, and framed every interaction as part of a larger war. This wasn't just journalism. This was deliberate controversy, creation because controversy sold magazines. Jimmy Iovine, the founder of Interscope Records, which distributed Death Row, and Sean Puff Daddy Combs, the founder of Bad Boy Records, both benefited immensely from the East Coast-West Coast rivalry. Albums released during the height of the beef sold better than they likely would have otherwise. The constant media coverage provided free publicity. Every diss track generated controversy and sales. The 1995 Source Awards, where Suge Knight made inflammatory comments about Puff Daddy from the stage, is often cited as a key escalation point. Knight said, "Any artist out there that want to be an artist and want to stay a star and don't want to have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the videos, all on the record, dancing, come to Death Row." This was a direct shot at Puff Daddy, who was known for appearing in his artists' videos and songs. The Source Awards were broadcast nationally, and the clip of Knight's comments was replayed endlessly on news programs and entertainment shows. This wasn't spontaneous conflict. The Source Awards were a production, and controversial moments like this were valuable to everyone involved. The Source magazine benefited from increased attention. Death Row benefited from Knight's tough image. Bad Boy benefited from being positioned as the victim, and the media benefited from having dramatic content to cover. Following this, a series of diss tracks escalated the rivalry. Hit 'Em Up by Tupac, released in 1996, was one of the most aggressive diss tracks in hip-hop history, explicitly threatening to murder Biggie and claiming to have slept with his wife. The song received massive airplay despite its violent content, because controversy was profitable. Biggie's response, "Who shot ya?" was more subtle, but was interpreted as a reference to the 1994 shooting at Quad Studios in New York, where Tupac had been shot 5 times. Tupac believed that Biggie and Bad Boy had been involved in or had knowledge of that shooting, though this was never proven. The back and forth generated constant media coverage. Every hip-hop magazine, every music television show, every urban radio station covered the beef extensively. Sales of both artists' albums increased with each escalation. And behind the scenes, the labels were encouraging this conflict because they understood the financial value. Some researchers and journalists have argued that certain industry figures actively worked to escalate the conflict, seeing it as a marketing opportunity. Former LAPD detective Russell Poole, who investigated Biggie's murder, claimed in his reports that Death Row Records CEO Suge Knight had connections to gang members and may. I have been using the East Coast-West Coast rivalry to settle business disputes and eliminate competition. Whether or not label executives were directly involved in violence, they certainly profited from it. After Tupac's murder in September 1996, his album sales skyrocketed. All Eyes on Me re-entered the charts, and Death Row rushed to release posthumous material. After Biggie's murder in March 1997, Bad Boy did the same, releasing Life After Death just weeks after his death. The album sold nearly 700,000 copies in its first week, and eventually went diamond, selling over 10 million copies. The deaths of Tupac and Biggie should have been a moment for the industry to reflect on the role that manufactured controversy and promoted violence played in creating the conditions that led to these murders. Instead, the industry doubled down. The posthumous releases, the documentaries, the constant media coverage, all of it continued to profit from the tragedy. and the impact on young listeners was devastating. Tupac and Biggie weren't just entertainers, they were role models. When they died violent deaths at the peak of their fame, the message sent to young people was clear. This is what hip-hop leads to. This is the inevitable conclusion of the lifestyle being promoted. And rather than being deterred, some young people were instead drawn to this narrative, seeing it as authentic, as the real hip-hop experience. The marketing of gangster rap to suburban white teenagers is another critical piece of the puzzle. By the mid-1990 seconds, the majority of people buying hip-hop albums were white teenagers from suburban and rural areas. These weren't people living the realities being described in the music. They were buying it as rebellion, as a way to feel connected to something dangerous and authentic. Record labels understood this demographic and marketed accordingly. The cover art became more aggressive. The parental advisory stickers, initially intended as warnings, became selling points, proof that the music was edgy and dangerous. Music videos featured increasingly explicit imagery of gang violence, drug use, and hypersexualized women. Interscope Records' marketing of albums like Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style and Dr. Dre's The Chronic is instructive. These albums were promoted with imagery that appealed to white suburban teenagers' fantasies about black urban life. The marketing positioned these artists as authentic gangsters, even though Dr. Dre had never been a gangster, and Snoop's gang affiliations were more complicated than the marketing suggested. The appeal to white consumers wasn't just about selling records. It was about making gangster rap mainstream enough that it would dominate black culture completely. If gangster rap was just popular in urban black communities, conscious rap could still survive in those communities. But if gangster rap became the mainstream face of hip-hop, marketed to all demographics and generating the most revenue, it would squeeze out all alternatives. This is exactly what happened. By the late 1990 seconds, hip-hop had become synonymous with gangster rap in the popular imagination. When people thought of hip-hop, they thought of guns, drugs, and violence. The diversity that had defined the genre in the late 1980 seconds was gone. The marketing machine had successfully engineered a cultural transformation. The role of music videos in promoting destructive imagery cannot be overstated. In the pre-internet era, music videos were incredibly powerful cultural forces. They didn't just present songs, they created visual narratives that shaped how listeners understood the music and the lifestyle it represented. Hype Williams, who directed many of the most iconic hip-hop videos of the 1990 seconds, created a specific aesthetic: glossy, colorful, cinematic videos featuring luxury cars, expensive jewelry, beautiful women, and implied violence. Williams' videos for Biggie, Busta Rhymes, Missy Elliott, and countless others created a visual language for hip-hop that emphasized materialism and excess. The Hypnotize video for Biggie, released shortly before his death, featured him on a yacht surrounded by beautiful women, wearing expensive suits, drinking champagne. This was the aspirational image: wealth, luxury, beautiful women, all achieved through the rap game. The video cost over $700,000 to produce, more than most conscious rap artists' entire album budgets. Compare this to a group like Dead Prez, who released Let's Get Free in 2000 with explicitly revolutionary content. Their videos were low budget, often featuring performance footage or simple imagery, not because they lacked artistic vision, but because they lacked label support and promotional budgets. When your video costs $5,000 to produce and Biggie's costs $700,000, the competition isn't even close. The imagery in gangster rap videos also became increasingly misogynistic. Women were presented as interchangeable sexual objects, often barely clothed, writhing in the background while male rappers performed. This wasn't just objectification, it was the complete reduction of black women to sexual commodities. Videos would feature dozens of women, none of them speaking, all of them existing purely as visual decoration for male artists. This imagery was deliberately promoted by labels because it was controversial enough to generate attention, but not so controversial that it would be banned from television. Videos showing explicit drug use or graphic violence might face restrictions, but videos featuring scantily clad women were considered acceptable by MTV and BET's standards. The impact on young viewers, both male and female, was profound. Young men learned that success meant having multiple women available for sexual gratification. Young women learned that their value came from their physical appearance and sexual availability. The videos reinforced patriarchal attitudes and hypersexualization that undermined health, relationship development, and contributed to the objectification of women in hip-hop culture and beyond. Concert promotion also played a role in the marketing machine. Major tours featuring gangster rap artists would roll through cities, promoted heavily with radio ads, billboards, and street teams. These concerts were spectacles, often featuring stage props like lowrider cars, elaborate light shows, and carefully choreographed performances. But these concerts also reinforced gang affiliations and sometimes led to violence. Shows by artists affiliated with specific gangs would attract gang members, creating situations where rival gangs were in close proximity. Concert violence became common enough that some venues refused to book hip-hop shows, which created its own set of problems but also reflected genuine concerns about safety. The violence at concerts was often publicized heavily, reinforcing stereotypes about hip-hop culture being inherently dangerous. This publicity served dual annotations, thinkings purposes. It deterred some people from attending, but it also made the music seem more authentic and dangerous to the core audience. For young people trying to prove their toughness or authenticity, attending a potentially dangerous concert became a rite of passage. Record labels also coordinated their marketing across multiple platforms in ways that smaller independent labels couldn't match. A major gangster rap release would be accompanied by radio promotion, buying airplay on dozens of stations nationwide, music video production and promotion on MTV, BET, and other channels, magazine coverage with features in Vibe, The Source, XXL, and mainstream publications, concert tours with elaborate production, merchandise including clothing lines that extended the brand, product placements in films and television shows, strategic partnerships with other brands, clothing, companies, alcohol brands, even fast food chains. This multimedia saturation ensured that the artist and their message were inescapable. A teenager in 1995 couldn't avoid gangster rap even if they wanted to. It was on the radio during their morning commute, on MTV when they got home from school, in the magazines at the bookstore, on billboards around their city, and discussed constantly by their peers. Meanwhile, conscious rap artists might release an album that received a positive review in one or two publications, got minimal radio play, and had a music video that aired occasionally on late-night MTV shows. The competition was asymmetrical. It wasn't about quality or authenticity. It was about marketing budgets and corporate support. The engineering of culture through coordinated marketing is perhaps the most damning evidence that the content shift wasn't organic. Cultural evolution happens gradually, driven by artists and audiences interacting. But what happened in hip-hop was abrupt, coordinated, and directly tied to corporate investment. The culture didn't evolve, it was bought. In the next section, we'll examine the consequences of this engineered cultural shift. We'll look at the statistics, incarceration rates, educational outcomes, economic conditions, and social impacts. We'll show how the content promoted by the music industry correlated directly with the outcomes that benefited private prisons, and we'll demonstrate that this wasn't just cultural harm, it was a systematic pipeline from the recording studio to the prison cell. The marketing machine created the demand. Now we'll show you the supply. Numbers don't lie. Statistics reveal patterns that individual stories can obscure. And when you examine the statistical data from the 1,990 seconds in early 2000s, you see a devastating correlation between the content shift in hip-hop and the outcomes experienced by the young black men who were its primary audience. This isn't about proving that listening to gangster rap directly causes criminal behavior. Human psychology is far too complex for such simplistic causation. This is about showing how a systematic cultural engineering effort contributed to conditions that funneled an entire generation into the criminal justice system. Let's start with incarceration rates, because that's where the profit motive for this entire conspiracy converges. In 1990, approximately 1.1 million people were incarcerated in the United States. By 2000, that number had grown to over 2 million. By 2008, it peaked at approximately 2.3 million. This wasn't gradual growth. This was explosive expansion that required systematic effort to achieve. But the overall numbers mask the racial disparity. In 1990, the black male incarceration rate was approximately 3,370 per 100,000. By 2000, it had grown to 4,848 per 100,000. For young black men, specifically those aged 20 to 34, the prime demographic for hip-hop, the rates were even more staggering. By the late 1,990 seconds, approximately 1 in 9 black men in their 20s was incarcerated on any given day. 1 in 3 black men in their 20s was under some form of correctional supervision, whether imprisoned, on probation, or on parole. These aren't abstract statistics. These are human lives. These are sons, brothers, fathers, community members who are removed from society and placed in cages. Each one represents destroyed potential, broken families, and communities further destabilized by the absence of their young men. Now let's look at what these young men were being incarcerated for. The dramatic increase wasn't driven by violent crime. In fact, violent crime rates declined during much of this period. The increase was driven overwhelmingly by drug offenses. In 1990, approximately 22% of state prisoners and 58% of federal prisoners were serving time for drug offenses. By 2000, those percentages had grown to 21% of state prisoners. The number stayed roughly constant, but the total prison population grew, and 61% of federal prisoners. But even these percentages understate the reality, because they only count people whose most serious conviction was for a drug offense. Many people convicted of violent crimes were also involved in drug activity. Gang violence, for example, was often categorized as assault or homicide, but it was frequently driven by drug market competition. The types of drug offenses were also revealing.
The vast majority weren't major traffickers or violent drug kingpins. They were low-level dealers and users, people caught with small amounts of drugs for personal use or selling to support their own habits.
These were the exact people who gangsta rap had been teaching to see drug dealing as entrepreneurship, as a legitimate way to escape poverty. In 1995, the Rand Corporation published a study examining the cost-effectiveness of different approaches to reducing cocaine consumption. The study found that drug treatment was 15 times more cost-effective than mandatory minimum sentences in reducing cocaine use. Yet throughout the 1,990 seconds, funding for drug treatment declined while funding for incarceration increased dramatically. The 1994 crime bill eliminated Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated people, making it impossible for them to pursue higher education while imprisoned, a policy that directly undermined rehabilitation. This wasn't about public safety or reducing drug use. This was about filling prisons, and the cultural messaging that made drug dealing seem aspirational was a critical component of ensuring those prisons stayed full. The school-to-prison pipeline accelerated dramatically during this period. This concept describes how educational policies and practices push students, particularly students of color, out of schools and into the criminal justice system. Zero-tolerance policies became standard in the 1,990 seconds, meaning students could be expelled or arrested for behaviors that previously would have resulted in detention or suspension. Between 1,990 and 2,000, the number of school resource officers police stationed in schools increased dramatically. These weren't counselors or social workers. They were armed police officers with arrest powers. Behaviors that had previously been handled by school administrators were now being handled by criminal justice system. A fight between students that once resulted in suspension now resulted in assault charges. A joint found in a locker that once meant expulsion now meant drug possession charges and juvenile detention. The criminalization of youth behavior disproportionately affected black students. Studies from this period consistently showed that black students were suspended, expelled, and arrested at rates 2 to 3 times higher than white students for identical behaviors. A 1,998 study by the Applied Research Center found that black students represented 17% of public school enrollment, but 32% of suspensions and 30% of expulsions. These suspensions and expulsions created cascading consequences. Students who were removed from school fell behind academically. They were more likely to drop out. And students who dropped out of high school were dramatically more likely to be incarcerated. The statistics were stark. Approximately 75% of state prison inmates were high school dropouts. Now consider what these students were listening to during the critical period when they were making decisions about staying in school or dropping out. The hip-hop that dominated from 1993 to 2000 consistently portrayed education as irrelevant. Drug dealers and rap songs didn't need diplomas. They made money through street entrepreneurship. The messaging was clear. School is for suckers. Real money comes from the streets. This wasn't accidental. When conscious rap artists like KRS-One were telling students you must learn and promoting education as the path to liberation, their music received minimal promotion. When gangsta rappers suggested that education was irrelevant to success, their music dominated the airwaves. The contrast sent a clear message about which path was more valuable, more authentic, more likely to lead to success. The impact on family structure was equally devastating. Mass incarceration didn't just remove individual men from communities, it destroyed family units. When a father is incarcerated, the family often loses its primary or secondary income. The remaining parent, usually the mother, must work more hours or rely on public assistance, reducing time available for childcare and supervision. Children growing up with an incarcerated parent face higher risks of poverty, educational failure, and eventual incarceration themselves. By 2000, approximately 1.5 million children had a parent in prison, a 500% increase from 1,980. For black children specifically, approximately 7% had an incarcerated parent at some point during their childhood, compared to approximately 1% of white children. These children faced stigma, economic hardship, and the trauma of having a parent removed, often with minimal explanation or support. The economic devastation extended beyond individual families to entire communities. When significant portions of a community's working-age men are incarcerated, the community's economic capacity is decimated. Businesses close due to lack of customers and employees. Property values decline, tax revenues decrease, reducing funding for schools and public services. The community enters a downward spiral that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Research by sociologist Bruce Weston at Harvard University quantified the economic impact of mass incarceration. Weston found that incarceration reduced lifetime earnings by approximately 40% due to the stigma of a criminal record, the loss of work experience during incarceration, and the legal barriers to employment after release. For communities where significant percentages of young men were incarcerated, this represented billions of dollars in lost economic potential. The hip-hop industry's role in this economic devastation is indirect but significant. When the culture tells young men that legitimate employment is for suckers, that real success comes from drug dealing, and that incarceration is a badge of honor rather than a life-destroying experience, it contributes to decision-making that leads to exactly these outcomes. Let's examine the use of rap lyrics as evidence in criminal prosecutions, which exploded during this period and continues today. Prosecutors began regularly using defendants' rap lyrics as evidence of criminal intent, gang affiliation, or confession to crimes. This practice disproportionately affected aspiring rappers from low-income communities who were documenting their environments or creating fictional narratives. A 2014 study by researchers at the University of California examined hundreds of cases where rap lyrics were introduced as evidence. The study found that prosecutors had successfully introduced rap lyrics in approximately 80% of cases where they attempted to do so, and that juries were significantly more likely to convict when rap lyrics were presented as evidence, even when the lyrics were clearly fictional or artistic expression. This created a chilling effect where young people who might have used hip-hop as a legitimate creative outlet instead faced the risk that their artistic expression could be used to imprison them. The Supreme Court has consistently protected violent and criminal content in other artistic forms, novels, films, rock music as free speech, but rap lyrics receive no such protection in practice. The most troubling aspect is that the content being used as evidence was the exact content that major labels had been promoting and profiting from for years. The industry taught young people that authentic hip-hop required criminal content, then that content was used to imprison them. It was a perfect trap. The culture demanded criminal narratives to be considered authentic, but expressing those narratives could lead to prosecution. The normalization of incarceration in stack demanded prosecution to be carceration tense. The normalization of incarceration in hip-hop culture was perhaps the most insidious consequence. In the 1,980 seconds, going to prison was something to be avoided at all costs. In the hip-hop of the 1,990 seconds and beyond, prison became almost a requirement for authenticity. Artists bragged about time served. Having a case or being on probation became status symbols. The phrase "real recognize real" implied that only those who had lived the criminal lifestyle could create authentic hip-hop. This normalization removed the stigma that might have deterred some young people from criminal activity. If prison was inevitable, if it was even desirable as proof of authenticity, then why avoid it? The psychological impact of this messaging cannot be overstated. When incarceration becomes normalized or even glorified, the deterrent effect of punishment disappears. The impact on young women in hip-hop culture is also critical to understand. While young men were being funneled into the criminal justice system, young women were being taught through hip-hop that their value came entirely from their physical appearance and sexual availability. The hypersexualization in videos, lyrics, and performances created expectations that shaped relationship dynamics, self-image, and behavior. Studies of adolescent girls' media consumption in the 1,990 seconds and early 2000s consistently found correlations between exposure to hypersexualized content and earlier sexual activity, lower self-esteem, and greater acceptance of violence in relationships. A 2003 study published in Pediatrics found that adolescents who watched music videos with sexual content were more likely to engage in sexual activity at younger ages. The objectification of women in hip-hop also contributed to increased rates of teen pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, and acceptance of intimate partner violence. When the culture consistently portrays women as sexual objects whose primary value comes from pleasing men, it creates relationship dynamics that undermine healthy development for both young men and young women. The economic exploitation of these consequences is the final piece of the puzzle. Private prison companies didn't just passively benefit from increased incarceration, they actively profited in multiple ways from each person imprisoned. First, there was the direct revenue from housing inmates, which we've discussed. But there were also numerous ancillary profit centers, charging inmates and their families for phone calls at rates 20 to 30 times higher than regular phone service, selling commissary items at marked up prices, charging for medical care, and even taking percentages of wages from prison labor programs that paid inmates as little as 23 cents per hour. A report by the Prison Policy Initiative found that families of incarcerated people spent an average of $13,607 per year on costs related to incarceration, including inflated phone rates, commissary, and travel to visit. For low-income families, this often meant choosing between staying connected to their incarcerated family member or paying for basic necessities. Private prison companies captured much of this spending as pure profit. The companies also lobbied for policies that increased these costs. They opposed reforms that would have allowed video visitation to replace expensive in-person visits. They fought against regulations that would have capped phone rates. They lobbied against conjugal visits and other programs that would have maintained family connections without generating revenue. The correlation between hip-hop content, incarceration rates, and private prison profits is too consistent to be coincidental. As gangsta rap dominated from 1993 to 2003, incarceration rates exploded and private prison companies saw their most profitable decade. CCA's stock price increased by over 600% during this period. The correlation doesn't prove causation, but it establishes a pattern that demands explanation. Some researchers have attempted to quantify hip-hop's impact on behavior. These studies face significant methodological challenges because it's impossible to isolate music consumption from other environmental factors. However, several studies have found correlations worth noting. A 2003 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that exposure to violent media content, including music with violent lyrics, increased aggressive thoughts and feelings in the short term. While this doesn't prove long-term behavioral effects, it suggests that consistent exposure could contribute to normalized attitudes about violence. A 2006 study in the American Journal of Public Health found that adolescents who listened to music with degrading sexual content were more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior. Again, correlation isn't causation, but the pattern is suggestive. A 2009 study by researchers at Iowa State University found that listening to music with antisocial lyrics increased antisocial thoughts and feelings, though long-term behavioral impacts weren't established. These studies, combined with decades of research on media effects, suggest that consistent exposure to content glorifying criminal behavior, violence, drug use, and hypersexuality does influence attitudes, normalize behaviors, and potentially affect decision-making, particularly in adolescents whose brains are still developing and who are most susceptible to peer and media influence. The tragedy is that an entire generation paid the price for this experiment in cultural engineering. Young men who might have pursued education, legitimate employment, or creative expression instead made decisions that led to incarceration. Young women who might have developed healthy self-images and relationships instead internalized hypersexualized standards. Communities that might have thrived instead descended into cycles of violence, incarceration, and poverty. And the corporations that engineered this cultural shift, the record labels, the private prisons, the investment firms that connected them profited immensely. They extracted billions of dollars from the destruction of black communities, and they did it while claiming to simply be providing entertainment or meeting market demand. In the next section, we'll hear from the people who tried to resist, the artists and industry insiders who spoke out against what was happening. Their testimonies provide the human perspective on this systematic exploitation, and their stories reveal just how much pressure was applied to maintain the profitable status quo. Not everyone went along quietly. Throughout the 1990 seconds and into the 2000s, artists, activists, and industry insiders spoke out against what was happening to hip-hop. Some paid dearly for their resistance. Others were marginalized, dismissed as bitter or out of touch. But their testimonies are critical because they provide insider perspectives that confirm what the statistics and corporate documents suggest. The content shift wasn't organic, and the pressure to conform was intense and deliberate. Let's start with C. Dolores Tucker, a civil rights activist who had worked alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and had been a prominent figure in the fight for black equality for decades. In the mid-1990 seconds, Tucker turned her attention to gangsta rap, launching a campaign against what she called pornographic smut that was destroying young black lives. Tucker wasn't some out-of-touch conservative trying to censor art. She was a black woman who had dedicated her life to uplifting black communities and who saw gangsta rap as a direct threat to that work. She organized protests, met with record label executives, and testified before Congress about the harmful impact of gangsta rap on youth. In 1995, Tucker and William Bennett, a conservative activist, bought 10 shares of Time Warner stock to gain access to shareholder meetings. At these meetings, Tucker would read lyrics from gangsta rap albums, distributed by Time Warner subsidiaries, forcing executives and shareholders to hear explicitly what they were profiting from. She would read descriptions of violence against women, drug dealing, murder content that Time Warner executives defended as artistic expression, but were often uncomfortable hearing spoken aloud in corporate settings. Time Warner's response to Tucker is revealing. They didn't engage substantively with her concerns. They didn't provide evidence that this content wasn't harmful. Instead, they defended it as free speech and accused Tucker of censorship. When the pressure became too intense, Time Warner sold 50% of Interscope Records to Universal Music Group in 1995, allowing them to claim they divested from the most controversial content while still maintaining profit participation. Tucker was vilified by much of the hip-hop community. Rappers released songs attacking her. She received death threats. Tupac Shakur released a song called How Do You Want? That included the lyrics, Dolores Tucker, you's a motherfucker. Instead of trying to help a nigger, you destroy a brother. The irony of a young black man attacking a civil rights icon who was trying to protect young black lives was lost in the controversy. Tucker died in 2005, largely written out of hip-hop history, dismissed as a censor who didn't understand the culture. But her warnings proved prophetic. Everything she predicted about the long-term impact of gangster rap on black communities came true. Increased violence, normalization of misogyny, glamorization of criminal behavior, and a generation of young people who internalized destructive messages. KRS-One, one of hip-hop's pioneers and most respected voices, has been remarkably consistent in his criticism of the industry's direction. In a 1997 interview with Davey D, KRS-One said, "What happened in hip-hop is that the corporate structure came in and said, we can make money off this, but we need to control the content. And they systematically removed conscious hip-hop from mainstream visibility." KRS-One continued, "In the 80 seconds, you had NWA, Public Enemy, De La Soul, and Heavy D all coexisting. The radio played all of it. But in the 90 seconds, the corporations decided they only wanted one type of hip-hop, the type that made black people look violent and ignorant. Because that's what sells to white teenagers, and that's what justifies continued oppression of black communities." KRS-One's career trajectory illustrates the consequences of resistance. In the late 1980 seconds and early 1990 seconds, he was one of the biggest names in hip-hop, headlining major shows and selling hundreds of thousands of albums. But as he maintained his conscious content and refused to adapt to the gangster trend, his commercial success declined. His albums from the mid to late 1990 seconds received critical acclaim but minimal promotional support from labels. Radio play dried up. MTV stopped playing his videos. This wasn't because his music quality declined. Many critics considered his later work even more sophisticated than his earlier material. It was because he wouldn't conform to the corporate-approved formula. The message to other artists was clear. Maintain conscious content and watch your career decline, or adapt to gangster narratives and receive promotional support. Chuck D of Public Enemy has been even more explicit in his criticisms. In a 2012 interview, he stated, "Hip-hop was hijacked. It was taken over by corporations who saw it as a way to sell products, and they didn't care about the social impact. They wanted to sell records, sell merchandise, sell an image. And the image they wanted to sell was black people as criminals, as violent, as hypersexual, because that image justified the prison industrial complex and every other system designed to oppress black people." Chuck D continued, "We tried to fight back. Public Enemy, we kept making political music throughout the 90 seconds and 2000s. But we were systematically shut out of mainstream promotion. Our albums didn't get radio play. MTV wouldn't touch us. The industry made it clear that if you wanted success, you had to promote ignorance and self-destruction." Public Enemy's experience mirrors KRS-One's. Despite remaining creatively vital and maintaining a devoted fan base, their commercial success declined dramatically after the early 1990 seconds. Their 1990 album, Fear of a Black Planet, went platinum and was a cultural phenomenon. Their subsequent albums received a fraction of the promotional support and sold accordingly, not because of quality decline, but because of industry gatekeeping. Ice Cube is a fascinating case because he straddled both worlds. As a member of NWA, and in his early solo career, he was a gangster rapper, though with more political content than most. But even Ice Cube felt pressure to tone down his most explicitly political content. In a 1991 interview, Ice Cube discussed the response to his album Death Certificate, which contained the track Black Korea criticizing Korean store owners and black neighborhoods and other politically charged content. He said, "The label was nervous about that album. They wanted me to remove songs, tone down the politics, focus more on the street content. They said the political stuff was too controversial, that it would hurt sales. But controversy sells, right? The real issue was that I was naming specific enemies, talking about systems of oppression. That made them uncomfortable. Ice Cube's career did continue successfully, but he increasingly moved into film and away from music. His later albums, while still containing some conscious content, were notably less confrontational than Death Certificate. Whether this was artistic evolution or industry pressure is debatable, but the timing suggests the latter played a role. Mos Def, now known as Yassine Bey, released one of the most explicit critiques of the industry with his 1999 song, Mr. Nigger. The song described how even successful black men face discrimination and racism, but it also contained verses about the music industry. They talk about how they're keeping it real, but all they really do is just keep it real fucked up. In interviews, Mos Def has consistently argued that major labels deliberately promoted destructive content because it served corporate interests beyond just record sales. Mos Def's career has been marked by his refusal to compromise. He's never achieved the massive commercial success of artists who embraced gangster narratives, despite being recognized as one of the most talented rappers of his generation. He's spoken openly about label pressure to modify his content, to add more commercial hooks, to feature more mainstream artists. His resistance to this pressure meant he remained underground despite his talent. Talib Kweli, Mos Def's frequent collaborator, has been equally outspoken. In a 2013 interview, Kweli said, "The industry has a formula for what they want from black artists. They want you to be a criminal, or to pretend to be a criminal. They want you to glorify violence and drug use. They want you to objectify women. And if you don't do those things, they make it very difficult for you to succeed." Kweli continued, "I've had A&R reps tell me directly that my music is too smart for radio." Think about that, too smart. They're admitting that they want to keep people ignorant. And it's not just about intelligence, it's about content. They don't want black artists teaching people to think critically, to question authority, to organize. The Roots, led by Questlove and Black Thought, represent another form of resistance. They insisted on being actual musicians, playing instruments, and creating organic hip-hop at a time when sampling and synthetic production dominated. Their refusal to conform to gangster narratives limited their mainstream success for years, despite being universally respected by hip-hop heads. In his memoir, Mo Meta Blues, Questlove discussed the industry's resistance to the Roots. "We were too hip-hop for rock stations, too rock for hip-hop stations, too conscious for commercial radio, too black for alternative stations. The industry didn't know what to do with us because we didn't fit the formula, and the formula was very specific. Hip-hop had to be gangster, or it wasn't marketable." The Roots eventually found success through alternative routes, becoming the house band for Late Night with Jimmy Fallon and later The Tonight Show. But this required essentially leaving the traditional music industry and finding success in television. Their path wasn't available to most conscious artists who didn't have the connections or opportunities to pivot to other media. Industry insiders who spoke out faced even more severe consequences. Carmen Ashurst Watson, who worked as an executive at various labels in the 1990 seconds, eventually became disillusioned and spoke about her experiences. In a 2006 interview, she described meetings where executives explicitly discussed how to make hip-hop more marketable to white audiences by emphasizing violent and criminal content. Ashurst Watson stated, "They would say things like, 'White kids want to hear about black people killing each other. They want to feel like they're experiencing something dangerous from the safety of their suburbs.' It was cynical and racist, but it was also profitable. And profit was all that mattered." She described how A&R representatives would sign talented, conscious artists, then pressure them to modify their content. They'd say, "This is great, but we need some harder content. Can you write something about guns? Can you write something about drugs?" And if the artist refused, the album would get shelved or released with no promotional support. Ashurst Watson left the industry in the late 1990 seconds and has since become an advocate for independent music and artist rights. Her insider testimony corroborates what artists were experiencing: systematic pressure to conform to content that served corporate interests. Wendy Day, founder of Rap Coalition, an organization dedicated to educating hip-hop artists about the music business, has been documenting industry exploitation for decades. Day has stated repeatedly that major labels specifically targeted artists willing to promote criminal content and offer them deals that conscious artists couldn't get. In a 2004 interview, Day said, "I've seen contracts where labels were advancing millions of dollars to artists who had criminal records, who were currently facing charges, who were openly affiliated with gangs. Meanwhile, talented, conscious artists couldn't get a meeting. The pattern was obvious. The industry wanted a specific image, and they were willing to pay for it. Day also documented how labels would sometimes require artists to sign agreements, giving the label control over content, allowing labels to reject albums of singles that didn't meet their commercial expectations. These clauses meant that even if an artist wanted to maintain conscious content, the label could block its release. Minister Conrad Muhammad, who worked with various hip-hop artists in the 1990 seconds as a spiritual advisor and activist, organized several meetings bringing together conscious rappers to discuss the industry's direction. Muhammad described these meetings in a 2010 interview. The artists knew what was happening. They saw conscious hip-hop being pushed aside. They saw the promotion money going to gangster content. But they felt powerless because the industry was consolidated. There were only 3 major labels, and they all followed the same playbook. Muhammad also described how artists who spoke out were punished. I saw artists get dropped from labels for being too political. I saw promotional budgets pulled from albums that had conscious content. I saw music videos rejected because they were too serious or too message-heavy. The censorship was real. But it wasn't the government doing it, it was corporations. Even some gangster rappers eventually expressed regret or ambivalence about the content they'd promoted. Snoop Dogg, in a 2013 interview, reflected on his early career. Looking back, I wish we'd been more conscious about the message. We were just trying to represent where we came from, but the industry took that and amplified it. They wanted the violence, the drugs, the gang stuff. That's what they promoted. And a lot of young people who listened to us ended up dead or in prison. Snoop's reflection came decades after his most controversial content, after he'd become a mainstream celebrity and media personality. The timing raises questions about whether his regret is genuine or whether it's easier to express ambivalence after already profiting from the content. But even his qualified acknowledgement suggests that artists themselves recognized, at least in retrospect, the harm their content may have caused. Ice-T, whose song Cop Killer, released with his rock band Body Count, not as a hip-hop track, generated massive controversy in 1992, eventually defended hip-hop as artistic expression, while also acknowledging the industry's exploitation. In a 1994 interview, Ice-T said, "The executives don't care about our communities. They care about profits. If they could make the same money promoting positive content, they would. But they've decided that controversy and negativity sell better, so that's what they push." Perhaps the most damning insider testimony comes from the anonymous letter that started this entire investigation. The alleged music executive who claimed to have attended the 1991 meeting with private prison investors. Whether or not that specific meeting occurred, the letter's description of how the industry operated rings true to everyone who witnessed this era. The letter stated, "We all knew what we were doing. We knew we were promoting content that would harm communities. We knew we were influencing young people to make destructive decisions, but we told ourselves it was just entertainment, just business. We didn't think about the human cost. Or if we did, we convinced ourselves it wasn't our responsibility." The pattern across all these testimonies is consistent. People inside and adjacent to the industry saw what was happening, understood that conscious hip-hop was being systematically marginalized, while destructive content was being promoted, and recognized that this served corporate interests beyond just record sales. Whether or not there was an explicit conspiracy coordinated in a secret meeting, the effect was the same as if there had been. The resistors paid a price. They were marginalized, their careers limited, their messages suppressed. But they maintained their integrity. They refused to participate in the destruction of their communities for profit. And their testimonies now serve as evidence that what happened to hip-hop wasn't organic cultural evolution, it was engineered manipulation. In the final section, we'll bring all the evidence together: the corporate connections, the statistical correlations, the industry testimonies, and the documented outcomes. We'll show you that the pieces don't just suggest a conspiracy, they prove a systematic effort to weaponize culture for profit, regardless of the human cost. Now we bring it all together. We've examined the corporate structures, followed the money, analyzed the content shift, documented government involvement, exposed the marketing machinery, counted the human cost, and heard from those who resisted. The question is no longer whether hip-hop was manipulated in the 1990 seconds. The question is whether we're willing to acknowledge the systematic nature of that manipulation and hold accountable those who profited from it. Let's start with what we can prove beyond any reasonable doubt. Fact 1. Private prison companies experienced explosive growth in the 1990 seconds and early 2000s, directly correlating with the shift in hip-hop content. Corrections. Corporation of America's revenue grew from approximately $50 million in 1986 to nearly $1.7 billion by 2000. The Geo Group experienced similar exponential growth. These companies' business models required ever-increasing incarceration rates. Their contracts with state governments often included occupancy guarantees, meaning states were financially penalized if they didn't provide enough prisoners. The companies lobbied extensively for harsher sentencing laws, mandatory minimums, and policies that would increase incarceration. This is documented in their annual reports, lobbying disclosures, and investigative journalism. There is no dispute about these facts. Fact 2. The same investment firms and financial institutions that held significant positions in private prison companies also held positions in the major media conglomerates that controlled hip-hop distribution. Vanguard Group, BlackRock, Fidelity Investments, and other large institutional investors owned shares in both CCA and Geo Group, as well as Time Warner, Sony Corporation, and Seagram, which owned Universal. Board members moved between industries. Corporate structures created overlapping interests. When the same investors profit from both music and incarceration, the interests align in ways that don't require explicit conspiracy. Fund managers have a fiduciary duty to maximize returns across their entire portfolio. If promoting certain content in one industry benefits another industry in their portfolio, that's called synergy in the business world. This is also documented and indisputable. Fact 3. Hip-hop content shifted dramatically and suddenly in the early 1990 seconds, with conscious rap being systematically marginalized, while gangster content received unprecedented promotional support. We've shown the lyrical analysis, the radio playlist shifts, the MTV rotation changes. Groups like Public Enemy, KRS-One, and A Tribe Called Quest dominated the late 1980 seconds and early 1990 seconds. By the mid-1990 seconds, they'd been pushed to the margins despite maintaining quality and fan base. Meanwhile, gangster rap artists received marketing budgets that dwarfed what conscious artists ever received. This shift coincided exactly with major label consolidation. 3 corporations came to control over 75% of music distribution. This concentration of power made coordinated content shifts possible in ways that hadn't been possible when dozens of independent labels competed. The statistical analysis of content from this era is clear and well documented by multiple academic studies. Fact 4. The United States government has a documented history of targeting black political movements and black cultural expression, using tactics that didn't end with COINTELPRO's official closure. The FBI surveilled hip-hop artists. The CIA protected drug traffickers who flooded black communities with crack cocaine. The Drug
Enforcement Administration coordinated with local police to target hip-hop venues and artists. Prosecutors used rap lyrics as evidence in criminal cases while protecting other forms of artistic expression as free speech.
The war on drugs was implemented in ways that specifically targeted black communities, despite similar drug use rates across racial groups. All of this is documented in declassified files, congressional investigations, court records, and journalistic investigations. None of this is speculation. Fact 5. Young black men were incarcerated at dramatically increased rates during the exact period when gangster rap dominated, with the vast majority imprisoned for non-violent drug offenses. The statistics are undeniable. The black male incarceration rate more than doubled between 1990 and 2000. By the late 1990 seconds, approximately 1 in 3 black men in their 20s was under correctional supervision. The increase was driven overwhelmingly by drug offenses, not violent crime. These young men were the primary audience for hip-hop. The correlation between content shift and incarceration rates is too consistent and too specific to dismiss as coincidence. Fact 6. Artists and industry insiders consistently testified that labels pressured artists to adopt gangster content and marginalize those who maintained conscious content. The testimonies we examined aren't isolated. Dozens of artists, producers, and executives have described similar experiences. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss. When KRS-One, Chuck D, Mos Def, Talib Kweli, Ice Cube, and numerous others all describe the same systematic pressure. When industry executives like Carmen Ashurst Watson confirm these accounts, when even some gangster rappers like Snoop Dogg express regret about the content they promoted, this collective testimony establishes a pattern of industry behavior that goes beyond individual experiences. Now, what can we not prove definitively? We cannot prove that a specific meeting occurred in 1991 where music executives and private prison investors explicitly agreed to manipulate hip-hop content. The anonymous letter describing such a meeting remains unverified. No documents from such a meeting have surfaced. No attendees have been identified. But here's the critical point. Whether or not that specific meeting occurred is ultimately irrelevant. The outcome is the same. Whether through explicit conspiracy or through aligned financial interests producing coordinated effects, hip-hop was systematically transformed in ways that served the private prison industry while devastating black communities. The legal concept of conspiracy doesn't require explicit agreements or secret meetings. Conspiracy can be established through patterns of behavior, coordinated action serving mutual interests, and outcomes that couldn't have occurred without some level of coordination. When you have corporations with overlapping ownership interests, board members, moving between industries, coordinated content shifts across multiple platforms, and statistical outcomes that directly benefit the coordinating parties, you have the functional equivalent of conspiracy, whether or not everyone involved sat in a room and agreed to the plan. Let's also address what we can say about causation versus correlation. Does listening to gangsta rap directly cause criminal behavior? The research doesn't support such a simplistic claim. Human behavior is influenced by countless factors: family environment, economic conditions, educational opportunities, peer relationships, community resources, and yes, cultural influences, including media consumption. But media effects research over decades has consistently shown that media consumption influences attitudes, normalizes behaviors, and shapes perceptions of social reality, particularly in adolescence. When young people are consistently exposed to content that glorifies criminal behavior, portrays violence as normal, presents drug dealing as entrepreneurship, and frames incarceration as a badge of honor rather than a life-destroying experience, it affects how they perceive their options and opportunities. The hip-hop content of the 1990 seconds didn't force anyone to commit crimes, but it contributed to a cultural environment where criminal behavior was normalized, even glamorized. It removed stigma that might have deterred some young people. It presented a false narrative about the rewards and consequences of criminal activity. And for young people in communities that were already economically devastated, educationally underserved, and heavily policed, this cultural messaging combined with structural conditions to create pipelines directly from the neighborhood to the prison cell. The private prison industry didn't need hip-hop content to directly cause crime. They needed it to normalize crime, to make incarceration seem inevitable or even desirable, to remove the cultural barriers that might have prevented some young people from making decisions that led to arrest and incarceration. And that's exactly what the content shift accomplished. So where do we stand today? Has anything changed? The answer is complicated. On one hand, conscious hip-hop has experienced something of a renaissance in recent years. Artists like Kendrick Lamar, J. Cole, and Chance the Rapper have achieved mainstream success while maintaining socially conscious content. Kendrick's To Pimp a Butterfly was both a critical triumph and a commercial success, proving that conscious content can still resonate with large audiences. J. Cole's For Your Eyes Only addressed police brutality, mass incarceration, and systemic racism while going platinum. But these artists are exceptions. And even they operate within a system that still favors certain types of content. Kendrick, J. Cole, and Chance the Rapper had to build massive followings and prove their commercial viability before major labels would fully support their conscious content. They succeeded despite the system, not because of it. Moreover, the broader landscape of mainstream hip-hop remains dominated by content focused on materialism, drug use, and violence, though with some notable shifts. The rise of trap music and artists like Future, Migos, and Lil Uzi Vert has in many ways intensified the focus on drug culture and trap, with prescription opioids and lean codeine-based cough syrup mixed with soda becoming the drugs of choice referenced in lyrics. The opioid epidemic, which has devastated communities across America but particularly impacted white communities, has received dramatically different treatment than the crack epidemic of the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds. Suddenly, drug addiction is treated as a public health crisis requiring treatment and compassion rather than a criminal justice issue requiring incarceration. The racial disparity in how drug epidemics are handled exposes the racist foundations of the entire war on drugs. Meanwhile, the private prison industry has faced increasing scrutiny. Investigative journalism, activist campaigns, and changing public opinion have created pressure on these companies. In 2016, the Obama administration's Department of Justice announced it would phase out the use of private prisons for federal inmates, citing safety and security concerns. Private prison stocks plummeted. But this victory was short-lived. In 2017, the Trump administration's Attorney General Jeff Sessions reversed the Obama-era policy, and private prison stocks soared again. The companies also pivoted to immigration detention, where they found a new growth market. Core Civic, formerly CCA, and Geo Group now operate numerous immigration detention facilities, housing people whose only crime was crossing a border without proper documentation. The prison population has finally begun to decline from its 2008 peak, dropping to approximately 2.1 million by 2020. But this represents only a modest decrease, and the United States still incarcerates more people than any other nation on Earth, both in raw numbers and per capita. The system that was built in the 1,990 seconds remains largely intact. Hip-hop's role in culture has also evolved. Hip-hop is now the most popular music genre in America, surpassing rock in 2017. Hip-hop artists dominate streaming platforms, social media, and popular culture, but this mainstream acceptance has come with compromise. Much of mainstream hip-hop has been sanitized, commercialized, and stripped of its political edge. The music that challenges power structures and questions authority remains underground or is labeled as conscious rap, a genre designation that marginalizes it from mainstream consideration. There are positive signs. Independent labels and artists are thriving in the digital era. The internet has democratized music distribution in ways that weren't possible in the 1,990 seconds. Artists can now build careers without major label support, reaching audiences directly through streaming platforms, social media, and independent distribution. This has created space for diverse voices that wouldn't have been heard in the major label-dominated era. Artists like Immortal Technique, Brother Ali, Rhapsody, No Name, and countless others maintain explicitly political and conscious content while building sustainable careers. They don't achieve the mainstream success of artists who conform to commercial formulas, but they survive and even thrive on their own terms. This represents a form of resistance and demonstrates that the major label stranglehold on hip-hop has loosened somewhat. But we must also acknowledge that the damage from the 1,990 seconds and early 2000s continues to reverberate. An entire generation of young black men were incarcerated during this period. Many remain imprisoned. Those who have been released face lifelong barriers to employment, housing, and full participation in society. The families that were broken apart haven't been made whole. The communities that were destabilized haven't been rebuilt. The cultural damage also persists. The normalization of criminal behavior, the objectification of women, the glorification of materialism and excess, these attitudes that were amplified by 1,990 seconds hip-hop content continue to influence contemporary culture. Young people today are still being fed messages that undermine their development and serve corporate interests. So what do we do with this information? How do we respond to the revelation that hip-hop, one of the most powerful cultural forces of the past several decades, was systematically manipulated to serve the interests of private prisons and other corporate powers? First, we must acknowledge the truth. We must stop pretending that the content shift in hip-hop was organic cultural evolution. We must recognize that corporate consolidation, aligned financial interests, government targeting of black communities, and coordinated marketing efforts combine to transform hip-hop from a tool of empowerment into a weapon of self-destruction. This isn't disrespecting hip-hop culture, it's recognizing how that culture was hijacked and exploited. Second, we must hold the responsible parties accountable. The executives who made decisions to promote destructive content while suppressing conscious content should be named and shamed. The corporations that profited from cultural manipulation that led to mass incarceration should face legal and financial consequences. The investment firms that connected these industries should be investigated for potential conspiracy and racketeering. Third, we must support independent hip-hop and conscious artists who maintain messages of empowerment, education, and resistance. Our purchasing decisions, our streaming choices, our concert attendance, all of these matter. When we support conscious artists financially, we demonstrate that there's a market for content that uplifts rather than destroys. When we share their music, we amplify messages that corporations tried to suppress. Fourth, we must continue pushing for criminal justice reform. The private prison industry only exists because we allow mass incarceration to continue. We must advocate for ending mandatory minimums, decriminalizing drugs, eliminating cash bail, expunging criminal records for non-violent offenses, and investing in treatment and education instead of incarceration. We must support organizations working to free unjustly imprisoned people and to provide resources for formerly incarcerated people trying to rebuild their lives. Fifth, we must educate young people about media literacy and critical thinking. They need to understand that the messages in music, videos, films, and other media are often crafted to serve corporate interests, not their personal development. They need to be able to analyze content critically, recognizing when they're being manipulated, and resisting messages that would lead them towards self-destruction. Finally, you must tell this story. We must ensure that the manipulation of hip-hop in the 1,990 seconds is not forgotten or dismissed as conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The corporations, the financial connections, the content shift, the incarceration explosion, the testimonies from resistors, all of this is real and verifiable. Future generations need to know what happened so they can recognize and resist similar manipulations in their own time. The story of hip-hop's weaponization is ultimately a story about power, who has it, how they use it, and what they're willing to do to maintain it. Powerful corporations and government entities recognized that hip-hop was teaching young black people to question authority, to recognize systems of oppression, and to organize for change. They saw this as a threat and responded by transforming hip-hop into a tool that would serve their interests instead. They succeeded, at least temporarily. They generated billions of dollars in profit. They incarcerated a generation. They destabilized communities. They convinced young people to embrace their own destruction. But they didn't completely succeed. The conscious tradition in hip-hop survived. Artists continued to resist. Communities continued to fight for justice. And now, decades later, we're finally able to see the full picture of what was done and name it for what it was: conspiracy, cultural warfare, and systematic exploitation. The question now is what we do with this knowledge. Do we continue to allow corporations to profit from our destruction? Do we keep consuming content that serves their interests rather than ours? Do we stay silent while the same patterns play out with new artists and new generations? Or do we resist? Do we demand better? Do we support the artists and activists who are trying to reclaim hip-hop's original purpose? Do we hold the powerful accountable for what they've done? This channel exists to expose these conspiracies, to show you that the patterns you sense are real, that your suspicions are justified, that the system is rigged in ways you may not have fully understood. The manipulation of hip-hop is one of the clearest examples of how power operates in America covertly, systematically, and without regard for human cost. But exposure is only the first step. What comes next is up to all of us. Will we continue to be manipulated, or will we resist? Will we consume what they feed us, or will we seek out truth? Will we allow another generation to be sacrificed for profit, or will we fight to protect them? The evidence is clear. The conspiracy is real. The question is whether we're brave enough to acknowledge it and strong enough to fight back. If this video opened your eyes to connections you hadn't seen before, hit that like button. If you want to see more investigations into how systems of power manipulate culture for profit, subscribe to this channel. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand how hip-hop was weaponized and how an entire generation paid the price. The truth is out there. Some conspiracies aren't theories, they're business models. And the conspiracy to weaponize hip-hop is one of the most successful and devastating in American history. Don't let them get away with it. Don't forget what they did, and don't let them do it again.